Beatrice, a newly divorced, high-strung lawyer, and Marco, a laid-back, charming Italian artist, unexpectedly inherit a dilapidated inn in Tuscany. Forced to navigate their clashing personalities and a crumbling estate, they discover that amidst the chaos, laughter, and endless repairs, an unlikely love story can bloom, proving that sometimes the greatest adventures are found where you least expect them. Get ready for a heartwarming and hilarious journey under the Tuscan sun. Chapter 1. Arrival and Disarray. The Fiat 500, a relic from a bygone era that Beatrice had somehow managed to rent, coughed its way up the winding, cypress-lined road. Dust billowed behind it, a gritty, ochre cloud that momentarily obscured the breathtaking Tuscan landscape. Beatrice gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles bone-white, her meticulously coiffed blonde hair already wilting in the afternoon heat. This was not how she'd envisioned her grand Italian escape. "Serenity now," she muttered, channeling her favorite and frequently failing mantra. Her divorce from Richard, finalized just 3 weeks ago, had left her emotionally and financially depleted. The sale of their Upper East Side penthouse had funded this adventure. This desperate attempt to reinvent herself. This rundown inn. The Potera di Sole, as the faded sign proclaimed, looked less like a sun-drenched haven and more like a candidate for demolition. Vines, thick as pythons, snaked across crumbling stone walls. Shutters hung askew, like sleepy eyelids drooping after a long night. A terracotta roof tile, dislodged by some unseen force, lay shattered on the overgrown path. Beatrice felt a familiar knot of anxiety tighten in her chest. This was a disaster. A beautiful, sun-drenched, Italian disaster, but a disaster nonetheless. She'd pictured herself, Beatrice Harrington, former high-powered corporate lawyer, gracefully transitioning into a life of leisure and rustic charm. She'd envisioned mornings spent sipping espresso on a sun-drenched terrace, afternoons exploring ancient villages, and evenings filled with, well, she hadn't quite figured out the evenings yet. Loneliness, a constant companion since Richard had traded her in for a yoga instructor half her age, was the one thing she hadn't packed. The Fiat sputtered to a halt in what might have once been a courtyard, now a jungle of weeds and wildflowers. Beatrice killed the engine, the sudden silence punctuated only by the buzzing of cicadas and the distant bleating of sheep. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the scent of rosemary, thyme, and something vaguely goat-like. "Okay, Beatrice," she said to herself, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "You can do this. You've handled hostile takeovers. You've negotiated multi-million-dollar deals. You can certainly handle a slightly dilapidated inn." A rusty gate creaked open, and a figure emerged from the shadows of the overgrown garden. He was tall and lean, with a shock of unruly, sun-bleached hair that fell across his forehead. His eyes, the color of warm honey, crinkled at the corners as he smiled, a disarmingly charming smile that somehow made the faded paint on his t-shirt and the paint splatters on his jeans seem artistic. "Signora Harrington?" he asked, his voice a rich baritone, tinged with a melodic Italian accent. Beatrice, momentarily mesmerized, managed a stiff nod. "Benvenuta al Potera di Sole," he continued, spreading his arms wide, a gesture that encompassed the crumbling beauty of the inn. "I am Marco Bellini, your co-owner." The word co-owner hung in the air, heavy and unwelcome. Beatrice had been under the impression, gleaned from a series of increasingly frustrating emails with a lawyer in Florence, that she was the sole inheritor of the inn. Her great-aunt Isabella, a woman she'd met only twice, had apparently left it to her in a will that was as eccentric as Isabella herself. "Co-owner?" Beatrice repeated, her voice sharper than she intended. The carefully constructed facade of calm she'd been building began to crack. Marco's smile faltered slightly. "See, my grandfather and your great-aunt, they had an arrangement. A partnership." He shrugged, a typically Italian gesture that managed to convey both apology and a hint of amusement. "It is all very complicated. The lawyer, Signor Rossi, he explained it, no?" Beatrice had skimmed Signor Rossi's emails, overwhelmed by the legalese and the sheer volume of them. She'd been more focused on escaping New York than on the fine print of her inheritance. Not entirely, she admitted, feeling a wave of heat creep up her neck. Marco chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that, against her will, sent a tiny shiver down Beatrice's spine. Ah, the lawyers. They make everything so confusing. He stepped closer, his gaze sweeping over her, taking in her tailored linen suit, her designer handbag, her perfectly polished appearance. He looked like he'd just stepped out of an artist's bohemian dream, while she looked ready for a board meeting. The contrast was jarring. "You are very different from what I expected," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Beatrice bristled. "And what, pray tell, did you expect?" He gestured vaguely towards the dilapidated inn. "Someone more rustic? Perhaps someone who does not look like she is about to attend a cocktail party?" Beatrice's hands clenched into fists. This was exactly the kind of laid-back, disorganized attitude she'd been trying to escape. "I assure you, Mr. Bellini, I am perfectly capable of handling this situation." "Marco," he corrected gently. "And I am sure you are, Signora Harrington. But perhaps together we can handle it better?" He offered his hand, his palm calloused but warm. Beatrice hesitated. She was a woman who thrived on control, on order, on meticulously planned strategies. This chaotic, charming Italian artist was the antithesis of everything she knew. But she was also stranded in the middle of the Tuscan countryside, with a crumbling inn, a minuscule budget, and a co-owner who seemed determined to test her patience. She took his hand, the contact sending another unexpected jolt through her. His grip was firm, surprisingly strong. "Beatrice," she said, her voice softer now. "And I suppose together it is." As they stood there, hand in hand, amidst the ruins of their shared inheritance, a rooster crowed in the distance, a loud, raucous sound that seemed to herald the beginning of something unexpected. The sun, beginning its descent, cast long shadows across the courtyard, painting the scene in shades of gold and amber. Beatrice, despite her apprehension, felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Or maybe it was just the Tuscan sun getting to her. Either way, she had a feeling her life was about to get a whole lot more complicated and a whole lot more interesting. The only question that remained was if it was interesting in a good way or a very, very bad way. She suspected, knowing her luck, that it would be a chaotic, hilarious mix of both. Chapter 2. The Basil and the Briefcase. The initial tour of the Pottera di Sole was, to put it mildly, disheartening. Beatrice, armed with a leather-bound notebook and a pen that cost more than Marco's entire wardrobe, documented every crack, every leak, every missing roof tile. Marco, meanwhile, wandered around with a bemused expression, occasionally stopping to pluck a sprig of basil or admire a particularly vibrant bougainvillea. "This," Beatrice declared, pointing to a gaping hole in the ceiling of what was presumably the dining room, "is a structural nightmare." Marco peered up at the hole, squinting against the sunlight streaming through. "It lets in the light," he observed cheerfully. "Very atmospheric." Beatrice resisted the urge to strangle him with her silk scarf. "Atmospheric? Marco, we could have birds nesting in here. Squirrels. Possibly even bats."
Marco shuddered dramatically. "Bats? No."
"Anything but bats. They are creepy." He then brightened. "But think of the possibilities. We could have a natural skylight. Very romantic, no?" Beatrice sighed. Romantic was not the word that sprang to mind. Practical and habitable were higher on her priority list. She made a note in her notebook. Hole in ceiling extremely urgent. The kitchen was even worse. The ancient stove looked like it belonged in a museum. The sink was stained a permanent shade of brown, and the only visible appliance was a vintage espresso machine that, while charming, probably violated every health code in existence. "This," Beatrice said, gesturing around the room with a sweeping hand, "is a health hazard." Marco, who had been examining the espresso machine with an almost reverent expression, looked up. "But it makes excellent coffee," he said, as if that solved everything. "My nana used this machine for 50 years. It has history." Beatrice was beginning to understand the arrangement between their respective relatives. She suspected it involved a lot of wine and a complete disregard for building codes. History is wonderful, Marco, but we need a functioning kitchen. We need appliances. We need a dishwasher. Marco looked horrified. A dishwasher? But that is sacrilege. Washing dishes by hand is therapeutic. It connects you to the essence of the food. Beatrice stared at him. The essence of the food? Marco, we're going to be running an inn, not a Zen retreat. She added another note to her ever-growing list. Kitchen complete overhaul. The bedrooms were, surprisingly, slightly less disastrous. While the furniture was old and mismatched, the rooms themselves were spacious and airy, with large windows offering stunning views of the surrounding countryside. The problem, however, was the distinct lack of beds. There were mattresses, yes, stacked haphazardly in a corner, but no actual bed frames. Where are the beds? Beatrice asked, her voice laced with a hint of desperation.
Marco Stragd.
In the barn, he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. My grandfather used to store them there. He said they attracted dust. Beatrice closed her eyes, counting to 10. She was beginning to feel like she'd stepped into a surrealist comedy. The barn, she repeated slowly. Of course. Because that's where everyone keeps their beds. The barn, predictably, was even more chaotic than the inn. It was crammed with a jumble of old furniture, farm equipment, and various unidentifiable objects covered in dust and cobwebs. Beatrice, ever the practical one, pulled out her phone, intending to call a moving company. No signal, of course. We'll have to do it ourselves, Marco said, already rolling up his sleeves. He seemed unfazed by the sheer volume of work ahead of them. It will be fun. Beatrice doubted the fun part, but she knew he was right. They were on their own. She carefully placed her briefcase, a symbol of her former life, on a relatively clean stack of hay. It looked utterly out of place, a stark reminder of the world she'd left behind. As they began the arduous task of hauling mattresses and bed frames from the barn to the inn, Beatrice couldn't help but notice Marco's strength. He moved with an easy grace, his muscles rippling beneath his faded t-shirt. He was, she had to admit, undeniably attractive. And his constant optimism, while occasionally infuriating, was also endearing. During a brief water break, Marco offered her a sprig of basil, its scent fresh and invigorating. For you, he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. To calm your nerves. Beatrice, surprised by the gesture, took the basil, its leaves soft against her fingertips. She inhaled its fragrance, a tiny smile playing on her lips. Thank you, Marco, she said, her voice softer than it had been all day. He smiled back, a genuine, heart-stopping smile that made her forget, for a moment, the crumbling inn, the daunting task ahead, and the gaping hole in the ceiling. Prego, Beatrice, he said. We will make this work. Together. As they returned to their labors, a shared sense of purpose, however fragile, began to emerge. The sun beat down, the cicadas buzzed, and the scent of basil mingled with the dust and sweat. Beatrice, despite her initial reservations, found herself laughing at Marco's jokes, his attempts to speak English often resulting in hilarious misunderstandings. She even found herself, dare she admit it, enjoying the physical labor. It was a far cry from her sterile office in Manhattan, but it was real. And, surprisingly, it was starting to feel right. Later that evening, exhausted but strangely exhilarated, they sat on the steps of the inn, sharing a bottle of local wine and a simple meal of bread, cheese, and tomatoes. The setting sun painted the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple. Beatrice, looking at Marco, his face illuminated by the soft glow of twilight, felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected, attraction. It was a dangerous feeling, she knew, but she couldn't deny it. She was, after all, only human. And he was, after all, very, very Italian. The briefcase, forgotten on its hay bale throne, seemed a million miles away. Chapter 3. Paint, Pasta, and Panic. The next morning dawned bright and hot, the promise of another grueling day hanging in the air. Beatrice, Fueled by a strong espresso courtesy of the vintage machine, which, she had to admit, did make excellent coffee, was determined to tackle the renovation with renewed vigor. She'd even traded her linen suit for a pair of jeans and a t-shirt, though she'd carefully accessorized with a silk scarf, a small concession to her former self. Marco, on the other hand, appeared to have embraced the chaos. He emerged from his room which, Beatrice had discovered, was surprisingly tidy compared to the rest of the inn, wearing a pair of paint-splattered overalls and a bandana tied around his head. He looked, she thought, like a pirate who'd traded his ship for a paintbrush. "Ready to make some magic, Beatrice?" he asked, brandishing a paintbrush with a flourish. Beatrice, armed with her notebook and a color chart she'd miraculously found in a drawer, was less enthusiastic. "Ready to make some order," she corrected. "We need a plan, Marco. A detailed, step-by-step plan." Marco waved his hand dismissively. "Plans are for bureaucrats. We will let the inspiration guide us." Beatrice groaned inwardly. This was going to be a long day. Their first task was painting the living room, a large, airy space with high ceilings and beautiful, albeit dirty, windows. Beatrice had chosen a soft, creamy white, a color she felt would be both calming and elegant. Marco, however, had other ideas. "White is boring," he declared, wrinkling his nose. "We need color. Something vibrant. Like the sunflowers." He gestured towards a field of sunflowers visible through the window, their bright yellow heads bobbing in the breeze. Beatrice shuddered. "Sunflower yellow? Marco, this is an inn, not a circus. But it will be cheerful," he insisted. "It will make people happy." The ensuing argument, conducted in a mixture of English, Italian, and increasingly frantic hand gestures, lasted a good hour. Beatrice, using her well-honed negotiation skills, eventually managed to convince Marco to compromise. They would paint the walls white, but add a touch of color with accent walls. Marco, after much deliberation, chose a vibrant shade of turquoise for one wall, a color he claimed was inspired by the Tuscan sky. Beatrice, secretly relieved that he hadn't insisted on sunflower yellow, agreed. The actual painting process was, predictably, chaotic. Marco, despite his artistic background, was surprisingly messy. He managed to get paint on his hair, his clothes, and even, at one point, on Beatrice's nose. "Marco!" Beatrice exclaimed, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "You're worse than a child." Marco grinned, his eyes twinkling with mischief. "But it is fun, no?" He then proceeded to flick a dollop of turquoise paint at her, hitting her squarely on the cheek. Beatrice gasped, momentarily speechless. She was about to launch into a lecture about professionalism and proper painting techniques when she saw the look on Marco's face. He was laughing, a genuine, infectious laugh that made his eyes sparkle. And, against her will, she found herself laughing too. The paint fight that ensued was epic. Turquoise and white paint flew through the air, splattering the walls, the floor, and each other. By the time they were finished, they were both covered head to toe in paint, looking like two very colorful, very messy children. Exhausted but exhilarated, they collapsed onto the floor, surrounded by paint cans and brushes. Beatrice, looking at Marco, his face smeared with paint, felt a wave of unexpected affection. He was infuriating, disorganized, and completely impractical, but he was also alive. He made her feel alive, in a way she hadn't felt in years. "I suppose," she said, wiping a streak of paint from her forehead, "this is one way to renovate an inn." Marco chuckled. "The best way," he said, his voice soft. "We are creating something together." The afternoon was devoted to cooking. Beatrice, determined to impress Marco with her admittedly limited culinary skills, decided to make pasta. She'd found a recipe in an old cookbook, written in Italian, which she'd painstakingly translated using her phone. Marco, meanwhile, offered to make the sauce. He claimed to have inherited his Nana's secret recipe, a recipe that had been passed down through generations. The kitchen, despite its dilapidated state, soon filled with the delicious aroma of garlic, tomatoes, and basil. Beatrice, carefully following the recipe, managed to produce a pot of perfectly cooked pasta. Marco, humming a cheerful Italian tune, stirred his sauce with a practiced hand. The panic set in when Beatrice realized she'd forgotten to buy cheese. "No Parmesan?" Marco exclaimed, looking horrified. "But pasta without Parmesan is unthinkable." Beatrice, feeling a familiar wave of anxiety, was about to suggest they make do without it when Marco had an idea. "We will go to the market," he declared. "It is just down the road." The market turned out to be a small, bustling square in the nearby village, filled with stalls selling fresh produce, cheese, bread, and various other local delicacies. Beatrice, overwhelmed by the sights and sounds, felt a surge of excitement. This was the Italy she'd dreamed of, the Italy she'd longed to experience. Marco, a natural at navigating the crowded market, led her through the stalls, introducing her to the vendors, haggling over prices, and filling their basket with an assortment of delicious-looking goodies. He even managed to charm a grumpy-looking cheesemonger into giving them a generous sample of aged Parmesan. As they walked back to the inn, their arms laden with shopping bags, the setting sun casting a golden glow over the rolling hills, Beatrice felt a sense of contentment she hadn't experienced in a long time. She was starting to understand Marco's love for this place, for this simple, unhurried way of life. That evening, they ate their pasta, topped with Marco's delicious sauce and a generous grating of Parmesan, on the terrace, under a sky full of stars. The food was exquisite, the wine flowed freely, and the conversation, a mixture of English and Italian, was easy and relaxed. Beatrice, looking at Marco, his face illuminated by the flickering candlelight, felt her heart skip a beat. She was falling for him, she realized, and there wasn't a thing she could do to stop it. The panic, for once, was a pleasant one. Chapter 4. A roof over their heads barely. The storm hit without warning. 1 minute, Beatrice and Marco were enjoying a peaceful morning espresso on the terrace. The next, the sky turned a menacing shade of gray, and the wind began to howl like a banshee. "Uh-oh," Marco said, his usually cheerful expression replaced with a look of concern. "This does not look good." Beatrice, who had a healthy respect for thunderstorms having once witnessed a lightning strike on a Wall Street skyscraper, shared his concern. "We should get inside," she said, grabbing her notebook and pen, which she'd been using to make a list of yet more necessary repairs. They barely made it indoors before the heavens opened. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind rattled the shutters, making the old inn creak and groan like a dying beast. Beatrice, huddled in the living room, watched the storm with a growing sense of unease. "I hope the roof holds," she said, eyeing the ceiling nervously. Marco, who was peering out the window, didn't answer. He was too busy watching a large tree branch, swaying precariously in the wind, come crashing down onto the Fiat 500.
"Oh no!"
Beatrice exclaimed, rushing to the window. The Fiat, her only means of transportation, was now buried under a pile of leaves and branches. "My rental car."
Marco winced.
"It seems we have a problem." The problem, as it turned out, was not just the Fiat. A loud crash from upstairs, followed by the sound of dripping water, indicated that the roof was, in fact, not holding. "I'll go check it out," Marco said, grabbing a bucket from the kitchen. Beatrice, not wanting to be left alone, followed him. They found the source of the leak in one of the bedrooms, where a large section of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole open to the elements. Rainwater was pouring in, forming a puddle on the floor. "This is a disaster," Beatrice cried, her voice rising in panic. "We need to call someone. A roofer. A contractor." Marco, who was calmly placing the bucket under the leak, shook his head. "No signal," he said, gesturing to his phone. "And even if we could call, no one will come out in this weather." Beatrice felt a surge of frustration. She was used to being in control, to having solutions at her fingertips. This helplessness was unnerving. "So what do we do?" she asked, her voice laced with despair. Marco looked at her, his eyes surprisingly calm. "We fix it," he said. "We have tarps." In the barn. The barn, in the pouring rain, was even more daunting than usual. Beatrice, soaked to the bone and shivering, helped Marco search for the tarps, which they eventually found buried under a pile of old farm equipment. Getting the tarps onto the roof was a Herculean task. The wind whipped them around like sails, and the rain made the roof tiles slippery and treacherous. Beatrice, clinging to the ladder, felt a surge of fear. She'd never been afraid of heights, but this was different. This was terrifying. Marco, sensing her fear, reached out and took her hand. "It's okay," he said, his voice reassuring.
"I've got you."
His touch, warm and strong, gave her the courage she needed. Together, they managed to secure the tarps over the hole, creating a makeshift barrier against the rain. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than nothing. Exhausted, soaked, and covered in mud, they returned to the inn, where they huddled together in the living room, wrapped in blankets. The storm raged on, but the worst of it seemed to be over. "I'm sorry about the car," Marco said, his voice filled with genuine remorse. Beatrice, looking at him, his hair plastered to his forehead, his clothes dripping wet, felt a wave of tenderness.
"It's just a car," she said.
"It could have been worse." He smiled, a tired but grateful smile. "You are very brave, Beatrice," he said. She shrugged. "I'm just stubborn," she said. "And I don't like being defeated by a roof." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that warmed her from the inside out. "We make a good team," he said, "even when disaster strikes." As they sat there, listening to the fading thunder and the gentle patter of rain on the makeshift roof, Beatrice realized he was right. They did make a good team. They were different, yes, but their differences complemented each other. Her practicality balanced his impulsiveness, her logic tempered his emotion. Later that night, after the storm had passed and the stars had come out, they sat on the terrace, sharing a bottle of wine and a simple meal of bread and cheese. The air was cool and crisp, and the sky was a breathtaking tapestry of stars. "Look," Marco said, pointing to a shooting star streaking across the sky. "Make a wish." Beatrice closed her eyes, making a silent wish. She wished for the inn to be a success, for their partnership to flourish, and, most of all, for her growing feelings for Marco to be reciprocated. When she opened her eyes, Marco was looking at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "What did you wish for?" he asked, his voice soft. Beatrice hesitated, her heart beating fast. "I wished for this," she said, gesturing to the inn, to the stars, to him. "For this new life." He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her breath catch in her throat. "Me too," he said. And then, before she could react, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a soft, gentle kiss, a tentative exploration of feelings that had been simmering beneath the surface. It was a kiss that tasted of wine and rain and the promise of something more. It was a kiss that sealed their partnership, not just as co-owners of a dilapidated inn, but as something deeper. Barely their roof over their heads suddenly felt a lot more secure. Chapter 5.
Fiesta Fiasco.
The annual Festa del Vino in the nearby village was, according to Marco, an event not to be missed. It was a celebration of the local wine harvest, a time of feasting, dancing, and general merriment. Beatrice, initially hesitant, was eventually persuaded to attend. She needed a break from the constant repairs, and Marco's enthusiasm was, as always, infectious. "It will be magnifico," he promised, his eyes sparkling with anticipation. "You will see. Everyone will be there." Beatrice, still recovering from the roof incident and the kiss, was skeptical. She'd envisioned a quiet evening, perhaps with a good book and a glass of wine. But she also knew that embracing the local culture was part of her new life, and she was determined to make the most of it. She even, at Marco's insistence, agreed to wear a traditional Tuscan dress, a flowing, colorful garment that she'd found tucked away in an old trunk in one of the bedrooms. It felt strange, wearing something so different from her usual attire, but also liberating. Marco, when he saw her, whistled appreciatively. "Bellissima," he exclaimed, his eyes widening. "You look like a true Tuscan." Beatrice blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her cheeks. She had to admit, the dress was flattering. It accentuated her figure in a way her tailored suits never had. And Marco's compliment, so genuine and heartfelt, made her feel beautiful. The Fiat, sadly, was still out of commission, so they had to walk to the village. The walk, however, was pleasant, the evening air cool and fragrant with the scent of wildflowers. As they approached the village, they could hear the sounds of music and laughter, growing louder with each step. The village square was transformed. It was a kaleidoscope of colors, with strings of lights, colorful banners, and tables laden with food and wine. People of all ages, dressed in their finest attire, were dancing, singing, and laughing. The atmosphere was electric, a vibrant celebration of life and community. Beatrice, initially overwhelmed, found herself swept up in the energy of the fiesta. Marco, a natural at navigating the crowded square, introduced her to everyone he knew, which seemed to be everyone in the village. She was greeted with warm smiles, welcoming embraces, and offers of food and wine. The wine, of course, flowed freely. Beatrice, mindful of her previous experiences with Italian wine which tended to be stronger than she was used to, tried to pace herself. Marco, however, had no such qualms. He drank with gusto, laughing, singing, and dancing with abandon. The fiasco began, predictably, with the dancing. Marco, fueled by wine and the infectious energy of the fiesta, insisted on teaching Beatrice a traditional Tuscan dance. Beatrice, who had 2 left feet and a distinct lack of coordination, was hesitant. "Come on, Beatrice," Marco urged, pulling her onto the dance floor. "It's easy. Just follow my lead." Following Marco's lead, however, was easier said than done. He moved with a natural grace, his steps fluid and effortless. Beatrice, on the other hand, stumbled, tripped, and stepped on his toes more times than she could count.
Sorry.
She apologized, for the 10th time, after nearly sending him sprawling. Marco just laughed, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "No worries, Beatrice. You are learning. Just relax.
Feel the music."
Beatrice tried to relax, tried to feel the music, but it was no use. She was too self-conscious, too aware of the amused glances from the other dancers. She was about to give up when Marco did something unexpected. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her waist, and began to whisper the steps in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. His closeness, his touch, his voice sent a shiver down her spine. Suddenly, she wasn't thinking about her feet, or the other dancers, or anything else. She was only aware of Marco, of his body pressed against hers, of his hand on her waist, guiding her through the steps. And then, somehow, she was dancing. She was following his lead, her body moving in sync with his, her steps matching his perfectly. It was exhilarating, freeing, and utterly magical. As they danced, lost in their own world, Beatrice felt a connection to Marco that went beyond anything she'd experienced before. It was a connection forged in laughter, in shared challenges, and in the simple joy of being together. The magic, however, was short-lived. A sudden downpour, as unexpected as the previous day's storm, sent everyone scattering for cover. Beatrice and Marco, laughing and drenched, found themselves huddled under a small awning, along with a dozen other revelers. The rain, while dampening the fiesta, didn't dampen their spirits. They continued to laugh and talk, sharing stories and jokes with the other villagers. Beatrice, feeling a sense of belonging she'd never experienced in her corporate world, realized that she was starting to feel at home. When the rain finally stopped, the fiesta was over. The square was deserted, the lights extinguished, the music silenced. Beatrice and Marco, hand in hand, walked back to the inn, the silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant sound of church bells. That was Beatrice began, searching for the right word. Unexpected.
Marco smiled.
Unexpectedly wonderful, he said, finishing her sentence. He stopped, turning to face her, his eyes searching hers. "Beatrice," he said, his voice soft and serious. He hesitated, as if unsure of what to say. Beatrice, her heart beating fast, waited. She knew what he was going to say, and she knew what her answer would be. Before he could speak, however, a loud noise from the direction of the inn shattered the moment. It sounded like a goat. What was that? Beatrice asked, frowning. Marco's eyes widened in alarm. Oh no, he muttered. Not again. He turned back to her with an apology. Beatrice, can we have this conversation later? Beatrice nodded, a mix of curious and irritated. Sure. What's going on, Marco?
It's
complicated, he replied, looking back at the inn.
just trust me.
They ran towards the inn, the romantic moment forgotten, replaced by a growing sense of foreboding. The fiesta fiasco, it seemed, was far from over. Chapter 6. The Art of Compromise or Not. The goat, a surprisingly large and stubborn creature with a mischievous glint in its eyes, was standing in the middle of the newly painted living room, chewing on Beatrice's leather-bound notebook.
Get out.
Beatrice yelled, waving her arms frantically. The goat, unfazed, continued to munch on her meticulously crafted renovation plans. Marco, who had arrived a few steps ahead of Beatrice, was trying a different approach. He was speaking to the goat in Italian, his voice soft and coaxing.
Bella, bella, I murmurd.
Come on, you naughty goat. Out you go. The goat, whose name was apparently Bella, ignored him. She seemed to be enjoying the taste of expensive stationery. How did it even get in here? Beatrice asked, exasperated.
Marco strad.
The door, it was open?
Maybe?
He didn't sound very convincing. Beatrice suspected that Marco, in his usual disorganized fashion, had forgotten to close the door. She was about to point this out when Bella, having finished her appetizer of notebook paper, decided to move on to the main course, the turquoise accent wall.
No.
Beatrice cried, lunging at the goat. She managed to grab its collar, but Bella was stronger than she looked. A brief but intense struggle ensued, resulting in Beatrice falling onto the freshly painted floor, covered in goat hair and turquoise paint. Marco, finally managing to get a hold of Bella's leash, which, Beatrice noticed, was a piece of frayed rope, pulled the goat out of the room, apologizing profusely. I am so sorry, Beatrice. She is usually very well behaved. Beatrice, sitting on the floor, covered in paint and goat hair, was not in the mood for apologies. Usually? She repeated, her voice dangerously low. Marco, this is unacceptable. We can't run an inn with a goat eating the furniture. Marco, who was trying to wipe the paint off her face with a damp cloth, looked sheepish. She is my aunt's goat, he explained. She lives next door. Sometimes she escapes. Beatrice's eyes widened. Next door? She repeated. You mean there are more goats? Marco avoided her gaze. Just Bella, he mumbled. Beatrice was beginning to understand why their relatives had been so eager to unload the inn on them. It wasn't just dilapidated, it was also goat-infested. The rest of the day was spent cleaning up the mess, repairing the damage, both goat-related and Beatrice-related, and trying to come up with a plan to prevent future goat incursions. Beatrice, ever the practical one, suggested building a fence. Marco, predictably, was opposed. A fence? He said, horrified. But that would ruin the view. It would be ugly. Beatrice, who was starting to feel like she was living in a sitcom, argued that a goat-free inn was more important than a pristine view. Their argument, conducted in a mixture of English, Italian, and increasingly frustrated hand gestures, lasted for hours. The art of compromise, it seemed, was not something they had mastered. Beatrice wanted order, efficiency, and a goat-free environment. Marco wanted beauty, freedom, and a goat-friendly atmosphere. They eventually reached a temporary truce. They would build a temporary fence just around the immediate vicinity of the inn until they could come up with a more aesthetically pleasing solution. The temporary fence, constructed from salvaged wood and chicken wire, was not a thing of beauty. It looked, Beatrice thought, like something out of a post-apocalyptic movie. But it was at least goat-proof. As they stood back, admiring their handiwork, Beatrice felt a flicker of satisfaction. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And they had done it together. It's not so bad, Marco said, trying to sound optimistic. Beatrice, who was still covered in paint and goat hair, couldn't help but laugh.
It's awful, she said.
But it works. He smiled, a genuine, heart-stopping smile that made her forget, for a moment, the goat, the fence, and the endless list of repairs.
We are learning, he said, to compromise.
That evening, they celebrated their sort of victory with a simple meal of pasta again, and wine of course. They ate on the terrace, under the watchful gaze of the stars, the temporary fence a silent testament to their ongoing struggle to find common ground. You know, Beatrice said after a long silence, I never thought I'd be building fences in Tuscany.
Marco Chakel.
Life is full of surprises, he said. He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. I'm glad you're here, Beatrice, he said, his voice soft. Even with the goats. Beatrice smiled. I'm glad I'm here too, Marco, she said. Even with the chaos. The chaos, she was beginning to realize, was part of the charm. It was what made this place, this life, so different. And it was what made Marco so irresistible. The art of compromise, she decided, was worth learning, especially if it meant spending more time with him. Even if it meant occasionally dealing with a goat named Bella. Chapter 7. Lost in translation. Found in each other. The language barrier, while often a source of amusement, was also a source of frustration. Beatrice, who had a basic understanding of Italian, could manage simple conversations, but she often struggled to express herself fully. Marco, whose English was better than he let on, sometimes pretended not to understand her, especially when she was being particularly demanding. Their communication, therefore, relied heavily on gestures, facial expressions, and a shared sense of humor. They were developing their own unique language, a blend of words, signs, and laughter. One morning, Beatrice decided to tackle the overgrown garden. She envisioned a beautiful, tranquil space filled with flowers, herbs, and perhaps even a small vegetable patch. She tried to explain her vision to Marco, using a combination of Italian words and elaborate hand gestures. I want fiori, she said, pointing to a patch of weeds. And herbi aromatiche. And maybe pomodori? Marco, who was supposedly helping her clear the weeds, looked confused. Pomodori? He repeated, wrinkling his nose. But tomatoes, they're messy. They attract bugs. Beatrice, who had a particular fondness for fresh tomatoes, was not deterred. Bugs are natural, she said. And tomatoes are delicious. We can make salsa. Marco looked horrified.
Salsa?
But that is Mexican. We are in Italy. Beatrice sighed. She was starting to feel like she was fighting a losing battle. She was about to give up when Marco did something unexpected.
He started to sing.
He sang a traditional Italian folk song, a song about love, loss, and the beauty of the Tuscan countryside. His voice, rich and melodic, filled the garden, silencing the buzzing of insects and the chirping of birds. Beatrice, captivated by his voice, forgot about the tomatoes, the bugs, and the language barrier. She simply listened, her heart filled with a strange mix of emotions. When he finished singing, he looked at her, his eyes searching hers. Do you understand? He asked, his voice soft. Beatrice, who hadn't understood a single word of the song, nodded. She understood the emotion, the passion, the love that he poured into his singing. She understood, without words, what he was trying to say. Yes, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I understand. He smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made her heart skip a beat. Sometimes, he said, words are not necessary. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. They stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by the overgrown garden, the silence broken only by the gentle breeze rustling through the leaves. The language barrier for that moment ceased to exist. They were connected, not by words, but by something deeper, something more profound. They were lost in translation, but they were found in each other. The rest of the day was spent working in the garden, not talking much, but communicating through shared glances, smiles, and the occasional touch. Beatrice, surprisingly, found herself agreeing with Marco about the tomatoes. They would plant them, yes, but in a separate area, away from the flowers and herbs. As the sun began to set, they sat on the edge of the newly cleared garden, admiring their handiwork. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. It was a space where they could grow, not just plants, but also their relationship. "It's beautiful," Beatrice said, her voice filled with contentment. Marco nodded, his eyes reflecting the golden light of the setting sun. "Like you," he said, his voice soft. He leaned in and kissed her, a slow, tender kiss that sealed their unspoken connection. It was a kiss that transcended language, a kiss that spoke volumes. It was a kiss that said, "I understand you. I see you. I care for you." Later that night, as Beatrice lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the Tuscan countryside, she realized that she was falling in love with Marco. She was falling in love with his voice, his smile, his passion, his everything. She was falling in love with his Italy, with his way of life, with his goats. The thought of the goats made her smile. She was even starting to find them endearing. She was changing, she realized. She was becoming less Beatrice, the uptight corporate lawyer, and more Beatrice, the woman who loved sunsets, gardens, and Italian artists. She fell asleep with a smile on her face, dreaming of sunflowers, tomatoes, and a certain charming Italian with a mischievous glint in his eyes. The language of love, she discovered, was universal, and she was finally starting to speak it fluently, even if she still couldn't quite pronounce Parmigiano Reggiano correctly. Chapter 8. The Olive Branch and the Open Wound. Beatrice discovered Marco's art studio quite by accident. She'd been searching for a missing hammer which, predictably, Marco had misplaced when she stumbled upon a small, dilapidated shed hidden behind a grove of olive trees. Curiosity piqued, she peeked inside. The shed was a riot of colors. Canvases, finished and unfinished, lined the walls, depicting scenes of the Tuscan countryside, vibrant portraits, and abstract explosions of color. The air was thick with the scent of oil paint and turpentine. It was a space of creativity, passion, and chaos. It was, she realized, Marco's sanctuary. She was about to leave when she noticed a particular canvas, tucked away in a corner. It was a portrait of a woman with sad eyes and a wistful smile. The woman looked vaguely familiar, and the raw emotion captured in the painting sent a shiver down Beatrice's spine. "She was my wife," Marco said, his voice startling her. He'd entered the shed silently, unnoticed. Beatrice turned to face him, her cheeks flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry," she said. "I didn't mean to intrude." Marco shook his head. "It's okay," he said. "You're not intruding." He walked over to the painting, his gaze lingering on the woman's face. "Her name was Sophia," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She died 5 years ago." Beatrice's heart ached for him. She'd known, of course, that he'd been married before. He'd mentioned it briefly in passing, but she hadn't realized the depth of his pain, the raw emotion that still lingered. "I'm so sorry, Marco," she said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. He shrugged, a typically Italian gesture that conveyed both sadness and acceptance. "It was a long time ago," he said, "but I still miss her." He turned to face Beatrice, his eyes searching hers. "She loved this place," he said. "She loved the sunsets, the flowers, the goats." Beatrice smiled, a sad, understanding smile. "I can see why," she said. They stood there, in silence, for a long moment, the unspoken grief hanging heavy in the air. Beatrice, wanting to offer him some comfort, reached out and took his hand. His hand, calloused from years of working with paint and clay, felt warm and strong in hers. He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you, Beatrice," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion. The moment, however, was broken by a loud bleating sound from outside. Bella, it seemed, had escaped again. "Marco Shahid." "I should go," he said, reluctantly releasing her hand. Beatrice nodded. "I'll help you," she said. They found Bella in the garden, happily munching on Beatrice's newly planted herbs. Beatrice, despite her initial annoyance, couldn't help but laugh. The goat, it seemed, was a constant reminder of the unpredictability of life. As they coaxed Bella back to her temporary enclosure, Marco offered Beatrice an olive branch, a small, symbolic gesture of peace. "For the herbs," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Beatrice took the olive branch, its leaves smooth and cool against her fingertips. "Thank you, Marco," she said. "It's beautiful." That evening, as they sat on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Beatrice decided to share her own story. She told Marco about Richard, about the divorce, about her feeling of being lost and adrift. Marco listened patiently, his eyes filled with empathy. "You are not lost, Beatrice," he said, when she'd finished. "You're here. With me." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "We all have wounds, Beatrice," he said, "but we can heal. Together." His words, so simple and yet so profound, brought tears to her eyes. She realized that he was right. She wasn't lost. She was finding herself, here in this chaotic, beautiful place, with this kind, compassionate man. The open wound of her past, she knew, would take time to heal. But with Marco by her side, she felt a sense of hope, a sense of possibility. The olive branch, a symbol of peace and reconciliation, represented not just a truce with a goat, but a new beginning for both of them. A chance to heal, to grow, and to love again. Chapter 9. Espresso shots and secret glances. The daily ritual of morning espresso had become a cherished routine for Beatrice and Marco. They would meet on the terrace, the vintage espresso machine hissing and sputtering as it produced their daily dose of caffeine. They would sit, often in silence, watching the sun rise over the Tuscan hills, the air filled with the aroma of coffee and the promise of a new day. These quiet moments, however, were often punctuated by secret glances, stolen moments of unspoken connection. Beatrice would catch Marco looking at her, his eyes filled with an intensity that made her heart race. She would quickly look away, pretending to be engrossed in the view, her cheeks flushed with a warmth that had nothing to do with the morning sun. Marco, too, was aware of her glances. He would catch her looking at him, her eyes filled with a curiosity that he found both intriguing and challenging. He would smile, a slow, knowing smile that made her stomach flip. Their unspoken attraction was growing stronger with each passing day. It was a silent dance, a delicate balance of desire and restraint. They were both aware of it, both drawn to it, but neither of them was quite ready to break the spell. One morning, as they were sipping their espresso, Marco broke the silence. "Beatrice," he said, his voice soft, "I have been thinking." Beatrice, her heart skipping a beat, looked at him. "About what?" she asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated, as if unsure of how to express himself. "About us," he said. "About this." He gestured to the inn, to the surrounding countryside, to their shared life. Beatrice's pulse quickened. She knew what he was getting at, and she was both terrified and exhilarated. "I like you, Beatrice," he said, his eyes searching hers. "Very much." Beatrice's breath caught in her throat. She'd longed to hear those words, but now that he'd said them, she felt a surge of panic. She wasn't ready for this, was she? "I like you too, Marco," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But, he prompted, his voice gentle. She struggled to find the right words. "But it's complicated," she said. "My life, your life, it's all so different." He nodded, understanding her hesitation. "Different, yes," he said. "But not impossible." He reached across the table and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "We can make it work, Beatrice," he said. "If we want to." Beatrice looked at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. She did want to. She wanted to explore this connection, this attraction that had been simmering between them. But she was also afraid. Afraid of getting hurt, afraid of repeating the mistakes of her past. "I need time, Marco," she said, her voice trembling slightly. He squeezed her hand gently. "I understand," he said. "I will wait." The secret glances continued, but they were different now. They were filled with a new awareness, a new understanding. They were no longer just glances, they were promises. Promises of something more. The espresso shots, too, seemed to take on a new significance. They were no longer just a morning ritual, they were a symbol of their shared life, of their growing connection. They were a reminder that, despite their differences, despite their fears, they were in this together. As the days passed, Beatrice found herself thinking about Marco more and more. She would catch herself smiling at the thought of him, her heart filled with a warmth that she couldn't ignore. She was falling in love with him, she realized, and there wasn't a thing she could do to stop it. The secret glances, the stolen moments, the unspoken words, they were all leading to something inevitable. Something beautiful, something terrifying, something real. The espresso shots, she knew, were just the beginning. The real adventure was yet to come. And she, despite her fears, was ready to take the plunge. Chapter 10. Under the Tuscan Stars. Marco decided to organize a stargazing night. He'd noticed Beatrice's fascination with the night sky, her habit of lingering on the terrace after dinner, gazing up at the stars. He wanted to share his knowledge of astronomy with her, to show her the beauty of the Tuscan sky in all its glory. He spent the day preparing, gathering blankets, pillows, and a telescope he'd inherited from his grandfather. He even, with Beatrice's reluctant permission, moved one of the goat-proofed mattresses onto the terrace, creating a cozy, makeshift bed under the stars. Beatrice, when she saw his preparations, was touched by his thoughtfulness. She'd always loved stargazing, but she'd never had anyone to share it with. Richard had considered it a waste of time, preferring to spend his evenings glued to his phone or watching financial news. "This is amazing, Marco," she said, her voice filled with genuine appreciation. He smiled, his eyes twinkling with pleasure. "I wanted to show you something special," he said. As darkness fell, they settled onto the mattress, wrapped in blankets. The telescope pointed towards the heavens. Marco, using a laser pointer, began to point out the constellations, telling her stories about the myths and legends associated with them. "That is Orion," he said, tracing the outline of the hunter with his laser pointer. "And that is Ursa Major, the Great Bear. And over there, that is the Milky Way." Beatrice, gazing up at the vast expanse of stars, felt a sense of awe and wonder. She'd never seen so many stars, so clearly visible, away from the city lights. It was breathtaking, magical, and utterly humbling. Marco, sensing her awe, moved closer, his arm brushing against hers. "It's beautiful, no?" he said, his voice soft. Beatrice nodded, unable to speak. She was lost in the beauty of the night sky and in the closeness of Marco. He continued to point out the constellations, his voice a gentle murmur, his knowledge of astronomy impressive. Beatrice, listening to him, felt a growing sense of admiration. He was so different from Richard, so passionate, so alive. As they lay there, under the Tuscan stars, a comfortable silence fell between them. It was a silence filled with unspoken emotions, with a shared appreciation for the beauty of the universe, and with a growing sense of intimacy. Beatrice, feeling bold, reached out and took Marco's hand. His hand, warm and strong, felt reassuring in hers. He squeezed her hand gently, his eyes meeting hers. "Beatrice," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He hesitated, as if unsure of what to say. Beatrice, her heart beating fast, waited. She knew what he was going to say, and she knew what her answer would be. Before he could speak, however, a shooting star streaked across the sky, a brilliant flash of light that momentarily illuminated the darkness. "Make a wish," Marco said, his voice filled with wonder. Beatrice closed her eyes, making a silent wish. She wished for the courage to embrace her feelings for Marco, for the strength to overcome her fears, and for the happiness that she knew he could bring her. When she opened her eyes, Marco was looking at her, his gaze intense and unwavering. "What did you wish for?" he asked, his voice soft. Beatrice smiled, a slow, knowing smile that mirrored his own. "I wished for this," she said, gesturing to the stars, to him, to their shared moment. "For us." He smiled back, a genuine, heart-stopping smile that made her breath catch in her throat. "Me too," he said. And then, Under the watchful gaze of the Tuscan stars, he leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that was different from their previous kisses. It was deeper, more passionate, more knowing. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a kiss that said, "I love you." As they kissed, the stars seemed to shine brighter. The night air seemed to grow warmer, and the world around them seemed to fade away. It was just them, under the Tuscan sky, lost in a moment of perfect bliss. It was a moment that would forever be etched in their memories, a moment that marked the beginning of their love story. The stars, it seemed, had aligned, and Beatrice, for the first time in a long time, felt truly happy. Chapter 11. A Brush with Jealousy. News of Beatrice and Marco's blossoming romance spread quickly through the small village. They were, after all, a rather unusual couple, the sophisticated New Yorker and the charming Italian artist. Their differences, which had initially seemed like an obstacle, were now a source of fascination and, for some, amusement. One morning, as Beatrice and Marco were enjoying their espresso at a local cafe, they were approached by Isabella, not the deceased great-aunt, but a very much alive and vivacious local woman. Isabella, a striking brunette with flashing eyes and a flirtatious smile, was known for her interest in Marco. "Marco, caro," she exclaimed, ere kissing him on both cheeks. "You are looking well." She then turned to Beatrice, her smile slightly less enthusiastic. "And you must be Beatrice, the American." Beatrice, feeling a surge of irritation, managed a polite smile. "Yes," she said. "And you are?" "Isabella," the woman replied, her eyes lingering on Marco. "I am a friend of Marco's." "A very close friend." Beatrice, who had never considered herself a jealous person, felt a surprising pang of possessiveness. She didn't like the way Isabella was looking at Marco, the way she was touching his arm, the way she was flirting. Marco, seemingly oblivious to the tension, introduced them formally. "Isabella, this is Beatrice. We are renovating the Potere di Sol together." Isabella raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Renovating?" she repeated, her voice laced with amusement. "How interesting. I had heard it was falling apart." Beatrice bristled. "It's a work in progress," she said, her voice sharper than she intended. Isabella smiled, a sly, knowing smile that made Beatrice's blood boil.
"I'm sure it is," she said.
"But Marco, he is an artist, not a builder. He needs someone to inspire him, someone to appreciate his talents." The implication was clear. Beatrice was not that someone. Marco, finally sensing the tension, intervened. "Isabella," he said, his voice firm, "Beatrice is very supportive of my art, and she is very good at building." Isabella laughed, a throaty, seductive laugh that grated on Beatrice's nerves. "Of course, caro," she said. "I'm sure she is." She then turned back to Marco, placing a hand on his arm. "We should get together soon, Marco," she said. "We haven't talked in ages. I have missed you." Marco, clearly uncomfortable, gently removed her hand. "Yes, Isabella," he said. "Perhaps sometime." Isabella, with a final, lingering look at Marco and a dismissive glance at Beatrice, finally left. Beatrice, fuming, turned to Marco. "She was flirting with you," she accused. Marco looked surprised. "Isabella?" he said. "No, she is just friendly. She is like that with everyone." Beatrice doubted that very much. She'd seen the way Isabella had looked at Marco, the way she'd touched him. It was more than just friendliness. "She's in love with you," Beatrice said, her voice flat. Marco laughed, a genuine, amused laugh that made Beatrice even more irritated. "Don't be silly, Beatrice," he said. "Isabella is just a friend. An old friend." Beatrice, however, wasn't convinced. She'd seen the jealousy in Isabella's eyes, the possessiveness in her touch. She knew, instinctively, that Isabella was a threat. The brush with jealousy, while unpleasant, had a surprising effect on Beatrice. It made her realize how much she cared for Marco, how much she valued their relationship. She wasn't going to let anyone, not even a flirtatious Italian woman, come between them. That evening, as they were working on the garden, Beatrice decided to confront Marco. "I don't trust her," she said, her voice firm. Marco looked up from his weeding, his brow furrowed.
Isabella? He said.
Beatrice, you are imagining things. Beatrice shook her head.
No, I'm not, she said. She wants you, Marco.
And she's not going to give up easily. Marco sighed. Beatrice, he said, I am with you. I love you. Isabella means nothing to me. His words, so simple and yet so powerful, eased Beatrice's anxiety. She knew he was telling the truth. She trusted him. But she still couldn't shake the feeling that Isabella was a problem. Just be careful, Marco, she said, her voice softer now. He smiled, a tender, reassuring smile that made her heart melt.
I will, he said.
I promise. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. They stood there, hand in hand, surrounded by the fragrant herbs and flowers, the setting sun casting a golden glow over them. The brush with jealousy, while unsettling, had ultimately strengthened their bond. It had made them realize how much they meant to each other, how much they were willing to fight for their love. And Beatrice, for the first time, felt confident that they could overcome any obstacle, even a flirtatious Italian woman with a penchant for goats. Isabella, as it turned out, was Bella's owner. Chapter 12. The grand reopening maybe. The grand reopening of the Potere di Sole was, to put it mildly, ambitious. Beatrice, with her corporate background, had envisioned a meticulously planned event, with invitations, a guest list, and a carefully orchestrated schedule. Marco, with his artistic temperament, had envisioned a more spontaneous celebration, with music, food, and a general atmosphere of festivity. Their conflicting visions, predictably, led to a series of disagreements. Beatrice wanted to send out formal invitations. Marco wanted to spread the word through the village grapevine. Beatrice wanted to hire a caterer. Marco wanted to cook everything himself, with the help of his friends and family. Beatrice wanted to have a strict schedule of events. Marco wanted to let things happen naturally. It's going to be chaos, Beatrice exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. We need order. We need structure. Marco, who was busy sketching a design for a hand-painted sign, looked up. Chaos is good, Beatrice, he said. It's creative. It's fun. Beatrice, who had a very different definition of fun, doubted that very much. She was starting to feel like she was planning a wedding, not a simple reopening. They eventually, after much negotiation and a few heated arguments, reached a compromise. They would have a semi-formal event, with invitations sent to a select few, mostly local dignitaries and potential clients, but they would also encourage the villagers to attend, creating a more relaxed and festive atmosphere. Marco would be in charge of the food, with Beatrice assisting and trying to maintain some semblance of order in the kitchen. And they would have a loose schedule of events, allowing for some spontaneity. The days leading up to the reopening were a blur of activity. Beatrice and Marco worked tirelessly, cleaning, decorating, and preparing for the big day. They had mostly resolved their differences, their shared goal of making the inn a success overriding their individual preferences. The inn, while still a work in progress, was starting to look presentable. The living room, with its turquoise accent wall now thankfully goat-free, was furnished with a mix of antique and modern furniture. The bedrooms, while still lacking some amenities like actual curtains, were clean and comfortable. And the garden, thanks to Beatrice's green thumb and Marco's artistic eye, was a blooming oasis of flowers and herbs. The day of the reopening dawned bright and sunny, the Tuscan sky a perfect shade of turquoise. Beatrice, feeling a mixture of excitement and anxiety, donned a simple but elegant dress, a nod to her former life, but also a reflection of her new, more relaxed style. Marco, looking surprisingly dashing in a linen shirt and trousers, a significant upgrade from his usual paint-splattered attire, greeted her with a kiss. You look beautiful, Beatrice, he said, his eyes filled with admiration. Beatrice blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her cheeks. You look pretty good yourself, Marco, she said, returning the compliment. The guests began to arrive, a mix of formally dressed dignitaries and casually attired villagers. Beatrice, playing the role of hostess, greeted them with a smile, trying to appear calm and confident, despite the butterflies fluttering in her stomach. Marco, meanwhile, was in his element. He mingled with the guests, laughing, joking, and charming everyone with his Italian charisma. He even managed to convince the mayor to try his hand at painting, resulting in a rather abstract mural on one of the walls. The food, predictably, was a hit. Marco, with the help of his friends and family, had prepared a feast of traditional Tuscan dishes, using fresh, local ingredients. The aroma of roasted meats, grilled vegetables, and homemade pasta filled the air, creating a mouth-watering atmosphere. The music, provided by a local band, was lively and festive, encouraging the guests to dance, sing, and celebrate. Beatrice, initially hesitant, found herself swept up in the energy of the event. She even, at Marco's urging, joined in the dancing, her two left feet surprisingly managing to keep up with the rhythm. The grand reopening, despite Beatrice's initial fears, was a success. The guests were impressed by the inn, charmed by the hosts, and delighted by the food and music. It was a celebration of new beginnings, of shared dreams, and of love. As the evening drew to a close, and the last of the guests had departed, Beatrice and Marco stood on the terrace, watching the moon rise over the Tuscan hills. They were exhausted, but exhilarated. They had done it. They had reopened the Potere di Sole. It was perfect, Beatrice said, her voice filled with contentment. Marco smiled, his eyes reflecting the moonlight. Almost perfect, he said. He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. We still have one thing to do, he said. He led her to the center of the terrace, where he'd set up a small table, adorned with a bottle of wine, 2 glasses, and a single, perfect red rose. What's this? Beatrice asked, her heart skipping a beat. Marco poured them each a glass of wine, then handed her the rose. A toast, he said, raising his glass. To the Potere di Sole. To new beginnings. And to us. Beatrice raised her glass, her eyes meeting his. To us, she repeated, her voice soft. They clinked glasses, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. They drank, the wine warm and fragrant, the taste of success sweet on their tongues. And then, under the Tuscan moon, Marco leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that sealed their triumph, a kiss that celebrated their love, a kiss that promised a future filled with chaos, laughter, and endless possibilities. The grand reopening was, perhaps, just the beginning of their grand adventure. But with a maybe hanging over it, they still had a lot of work to do, a lot of challenges to overcome. The maybe was a reminder that their journey was far from over. It was a promise of more surprises to come. Chapter 13. From Wall Street to Wine Country. Beatrice's former life, the fast-paced, high-pressure world of Wall Street, felt like a distant memory. She'd traded her power suits for jeans and t-shirts, her stilettos for comfortable sandals, her penthouse apartment for a dilapidated inn in the Tuscan countryside. She'd exchanged board meetings for goat wrangling, conference calls for olive harvesting, and Richard for Marco. The transformation, while initially jarring, was now something she embraced. She discovered a sense of peace, a sense of purpose, that she'd never known in her previous life. She was no longer Beatrice Harrington, the corporate lawyer. She was Beatrice, the innkeeper, the gardener, the lover of a charming Italian artist. One morning, however, a reminder of her former life arrived in the form of a package. It was a large, heavy box, addressed to her in Richard's familiar handwriting. Beatrice, feeling a surge of unease, hesitated to open it. Marco, sensing her apprehension, placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What is it?" he asked, his voice soft. Beatrice sighed. "It's from Richard," she said. "My ex-husband." Marco's expression darkened slightly. He'd never met Richard, but he knew enough about him from Beatrice's stories to dislike him. "Do you want me to leave?" he asked, his voice hesitant. Beatrice shook her head. "No," she said. "Stay." She took a deep breath and opened the box. Inside, nestled amongst layers of bubble wrap, were her belongings. Her designer clothes, her expensive jewelry, her collection of financial textbooks. It was a snapshot of her former life, a life that no longer felt real. Along with her belongings, there was a letter. Beatrice, her hands trembling slightly, unfolded it. Beatrice, the letter began, in Richard's typically formal tone, I hope this finds you well. I'm sending you your remaining belongings, as per our agreement. I trust you are adjusting to your new life. I must confess, I find it difficult to imagine you running an inn. I always thought you were destined for greater things. Perhaps you'll come to your senses and return to civilization. In any case, I wish you the best. Richard. Beatrice, feeling a mixture of anger and sadness, crumpled the letter in her hand. Greater things? She repeated, her voice laced with sarcasm. He thinks this isn't a greater thing? Marco, who had been reading the letter over her shoulder, placed a reassuring arm around her waist. He is a fool, Beatrice, he said, his voice firm. You are amazing. You have transformed this place. You have transformed yourself. Beatrice looked at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. He understood. He saw the value in what she was doing in the life she was building. He didn't judge her for leaving her former life behind. Thank you, Marco, she said, her voice soft. He smiled, a tender, loving smile that made her heart melt. You don't need his approval, Beatrice, he said. You have mine. That evening, as they were sorting through the contents of the box, Beatrice made a decision. She wasn't going to keep these reminders of her past. She was going to let them go. She donated the designer clothes and jewelry to a local charity, gave the financial textbooks to the village library, and burned the letter from Richard in the fireplace. Marco, watching her, nodded in approval. You are strong, Beatrice, he said. Stronger than you think. As the flames consumed the letter, Beatrice felt a sense of liberation. She was shedding her old skin, embracing her new life, her new self. She was no longer defined by her past, by her ex-husband's expectations, by the limitations of her former world. She was free. Free to be herself, free to love Marco, free to build a new life, a better life, under the Tuscan sun. From Wall Street to wine country, she had traveled a long and winding road. But she had finally arrived. She was home. And she was happy. The transition, while challenging, had ultimately been worth it. She'd found something more valuable than money, more fulfilling than power, more meaningful than success. She'd found love. And that, she realized, was the greatest thing of all. Chapter 14. The language of love and loud arguments. Despite their growing love, Beatrice and Marco still had their differences. Their cultural clashes, their contrasting personalities, and their unique communication styles often led to misunderstandings, disagreements, and loud arguments. One particular argument erupted over the issue of technology. Beatrice, accustomed to the fast-paced, digitally connected world of New York, relied heavily on her phone, her laptop, and her Wi-Fi connection. Marco, on the other hand, preferred a simpler, more analog existence. He viewed technology as a distraction, a barrier to real connection. We need Wi-Fi, Beatrice exclaimed, exasperated. How am I supposed to manage the inn's bookings? How am I supposed to communicate with the outside world? Marco, who was busy sketching in his notebook, looked up. We have paper, he said. And we have a telephone. And we have each other. Beatrice, who had been trying to explain the concept of online reviews to him, sighed. Marco, this is the 21st century. We need internet access. It's essential. Marco shook his head. Essential for what? He asked. For stress? For distraction? For losing yourself in a virtual world? Beatrice, feeling her blood pressure rising, argued that technology was a tool, a means of efficiency, a way to connect with people. Marco countered that it was a crutch, a source of isolation, a barrier to true intimacy. Their argument, conducted in a mixture of English, Italian, and increasingly frantic hand gestures, escalated quickly. Beatrice accused Marco of being old-fashioned, stubborn, and technologically illiterate. Marco accused Beatrice of being addicted, obsessed, and out of touch with reality. You're living in the past, Beatrice yelled. You're living in a screen. Marco ritorti. The argument reached a climax when Beatrice, in a fit of frustration, threw her phone onto the floor. The phone, thankfully, survived, but the screen cracked. Beatrice, immediately regretting her outburst, stared at the damaged phone in horror. "Oh, no," she muttered. "My phone." Marco, seeing her distress, softened. He knelt down and picked up the phone, examining the cracked screen. "It can be fixed," he said, his voice gentle. Beatrice, feeling a wave of guilt, apologized. "I'm sorry, Marco," she said. "I lost my temper." He smiled, a forgiving smile that made her heart ache. "It's okay, Beatrice," he said. "We all lose our temper sometimes." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "We will find a solution," he said. "We always do." They eventually, as always, reached a compromise. They would get Wi-Fi, but they would also designate certain times of the day as technology-free zones, allowing them to connect with each other without the distraction of screens. The language of love, they discovered, was not just about words. It was about listening, understanding, and compromising. It was about forgiving each other's flaws, accepting each other's differences, and finding common ground, even when they were arguing about technology. As they sat on the terrace that evening, enjoying a quiet moment under the stars, Beatrice realized that their arguments, while often frustrating, were also part of their connection. They were a way of challenging each other, of growing together, of learning to love each other, even when they were driving each other crazy. "I love you, Marco," she said, her voice soft. "Even when you're being impossible." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that warmed her from the inside out. "I love you too, Beatrice," he said. "Even when you're being a technology monster." The language of love, they knew, was a complex and ever-evolving thing. But they were learning it, together, one loud argument and one cracked phone screen at a time. The technology debate, while unresolved in the grand scheme of things, had brought them closer. It had forced them to communicate, to understand each other's perspectives, and to find a middle ground. And that, they realized, was what true love was all about. Chapter 15. A Canvas of Confessions. Marco decided to paint Beatrice's portrait. He'd been wanting to do it for a while, inspired by her beauty, her strength, and her transformation. He wanted to capture her essence, to immortalize her on canvas, to express his love for her through his art. He set up his easel in the garden, choosing a spot with a backdrop of blooming flowers and rolling hills. He asked Beatrice to pose for him, to sit still and be herself. Beatrice, initially hesitant, agreed. She'd never considered herself particularly photogenic, and the idea of sitting still for hours was daunting. But she also knew how much this meant to Marco, how much he wanted to capture her on canvas. "Just relax, Beatrice," Marco said, his eyes focused on his canvas. "Be natural." Beatrice tried to relax, tried to be natural, but it was difficult. She was acutely aware of Marco's gaze, of his scrutiny, of his artistic interpretation of her. As he painted, he talked. He told her about his art, about his passion for capturing beauty, about his inspiration. He told her about his childhood, about his family, about his dreams. Beatrice, listening to him, felt a growing sense of intimacy. She was seeing a different side of Marco, a side that was vulnerable, passionate, and deeply sensitive. "You are my muse, Beatrice," he said, his voice soft. "You inspire me." Beatrice blushed, feeling a warmth spread through her cheeks. She'd never been anyone's muse before. It was a flattering and slightly overwhelming concept. As the hours passed, Beatrice found herself opening up to Marco. She told him about her childhood, about her ambitions, about her fears. She told him about her failed marriage, about her struggles to reinvent herself, about her growing love for him. "I was so lost, Marco," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "Before I met you." Marco stopped painting, his eyes meeting hers. "You are not lost anymore, Beatrice," he said, his voice firm. "You are found." He reached out and took her hand, his touch sending a familiar warmth through her. "You have found your home, Beatrice," he said. "And you have found your love." His words, so simple and yet so profound, brought tears to her eyes. She realized that he was right. She had found her home, here in this chaotic, beautiful place, with this kind, compassionate man. The portrait, when it was finished, was stunning. It captured Beatrice's beauty, her strength, her vulnerability. It captured her essence, her spirit, her transformation. It was a canvas of confessions, a testament to their shared journey, a reflection of their love. Marco, looking at the finished portrait, smiled.
It is perfect, he said.
Like you. Beatrice, looking at the portrait, saw not just herself, but also Marco. She saw his love, his passion, his artistry. She saw their connection, their bond, their future. The canvas of confessions, she knew, was more than just a painting. It was a symbol of their love, a reminder of their journey, a promise of their forever. It was a masterpiece, not just because of Marco's talent, but because of the love that had inspired it. And as she looked at it, she couldn't help but admit that she'd never seen herself look so beautiful, or so in love. The painting had a depth to it that only came from the depth of their relationship. It was them. Chapter 16. The ghost of girlfriends past. The past, as Beatrice was learning, had a way of resurfacing, even in the idyllic Tuscan countryside. One afternoon, a sleek, black car pulled up to the Potere di Sole, a stark contrast to the rustic surroundings. Out of the car stepped a woman, tall, blonde, and impeccably dressed. She looked like she'd stepped out of a fashion magazine, a glamorous ghost from Marco's past.
Marco?
The woman called out, her voice carrying across the courtyard. Marco, who had been working in the garden, froze. He recognized the voice, the silhouette, the presence.
It was Alessandra.
Beatrice, who had been inside the inn, emerged, curious about the visitor. She saw Marco, his face pale, his expression guarded. She saw the woman, her beauty striking, her demeanor confident. She felt a surge of unease. Alessandra, Marco said, his voice strained. What are you doing here? Alessandra smiled, a practiced, polished smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I was in the area, she said. I thought I'd drop by. See how you were doing. Her eyes flickered to Beatrice, assessing her with a quick, dismissive glance. And you must be? She asked, her tone implying that Beatrice was of little consequence. Beatrice replied, her voice firm. I'm Marco's partner. Alessandra raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. Partner? She repeated, her voice laced with amusement. How interesting. The implication was clear. Beatrice was a temporary placeholder, a rustic distraction. Marco, sensing the tension, intervened. Alessandra, he said, his voice warning, Beatrice and I are renovating the inn together. We are living here. Alessandra's smile faltered slightly. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected to find Marco alone, vulnerable, perhaps even regretful. I see, she said, her voice cool. Well, it's charming. In a rustic sort of way. The conversation that followed was strained, awkward, and filled with undercurrents. Alessandra reminisced about her past with Marco, their travels, their adventures, their shared life. She spoke of their mutual friends, their favorite restaurants, their inside jokes. She was deliberately excluding Beatrice, reminding Marco of a life they had shared, a life that Beatrice was not a part of. Beatrice, feeling increasingly uncomfortable, excused herself. She couldn't bear to listen to any more of Alessandra's reminiscences. She needed to escape. As she walked away, she heard Alessandra's laughter, a light, carefree sound that grated on her nerves. She felt a surge of jealousy, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Isabella. Marco, noticing Beatrice's departure, excused himself from Alessandra and followed her. He found her in the garden, sitting on a bench, her face buried in her hands. Beatrice, he said, his voice concerned. Are you okay? Beatrice looked up, her eyes filled with tears. She's beautiful, Marco, she said, her voice trembling. And she's perfect for you. Marco knelt down in front of her, taking her hands in his. No, Beatrice, he said, his voice firm. She is not. You are. He told her about Alessandra, about their past, about their breakup. He explained that they had been together for a long time, but that their relationship had been turbulent, filled with drama and unhappiness. He told her that he had loved Alessandra, once, but that his feelings for her had faded. He told her that he loved her, Beatrice, and that she was the one he wanted to be with. You are my future, Beatrice, he said, his eyes searching hers. Alessandra is my past. Beatrice, listening to him, felt her fears easing. She believed him. She trusted him. But she still couldn't shake the feeling that Alessandra was a threat. As if to confirm her fears, Alessandra appeared, her expression determined. Marco, she said, her voice carrying across the garden. I need to talk to you. Alone.
Marco saí.
He looked at Beatrice, his eyes apologetic. I'll be back, he said. Beatrice nodded, her heart heavy. She watched as Marco and Alessandra walked away, their figures disappearing into the olive grove. The ghost of girlfriends past, it seemed, was not yet ready to be exorcised. Beatrice was left alone, again, with her doubts, her fears, and her insecurities. She knew Marco loved her, but she also knew that the past had a way of complicating things. And Alessandra, she sensed, was a complication they couldn't ignore. Chapter 17. Plumbing Problems and Pouty Faces. The plumbing at the Pottera di Sole, like everything else in the dilapidated inn, was temperamental. It had a habit of malfunctioning at the most inconvenient times, usually when Beatrice was trying to take a shower or when Marco was in the middle of washing his paintbrushes. One morning, the plumbing decided to rebel completely. The water pressure dropped to a trickle, the toilets refused to flush, and a strange, gurgling sound emanated from the pipes. Not again, Beatrice exclaimed, throwing her hands up in exasperation. This is ridiculous. We need to call a plumber. Marco, who was trying to unclog a sink with a bent coat hanger, looked up. A plumber? He said, his voice skeptical. But that will cost money. And I can fix it. I am good with my hands. Beatrice, who had witnessed Marco's previous attempts at plumbing repairs which had resulted in a flooded bathroom and a near electrocution, doubted that very much. Marco, this is serious. We can't run an inn without running water. Marco, however, was determined to prove himself. He spent the morning tinkering with the pipes, armed with a wrench, a plunger, and a YouTube tutorial. Beatrice, meanwhile, tried to find a plumber, but the nearest one was unavailable. Marco's efforts, predictably, made things worse. The gurgling sound intensified, the water pressure disappeared completely, and a foul-smelling liquid began to seep from under the kitchen sink. Marco! Beatrice yelled, her voice echoing through the inn. What have you done? Marco emerged from under the sink, covered in unidentifiable gunk, his face pouty. I don't know, he admitted, his voice sheepish. I think I made it worse. Beatrice, trying to control her temper, took a deep breath. Okay, she said, her voice strained. Let's not panic. We'll figure something out. They spent the rest of the day bailing water, mopping floors, and trying to contain the damage. They were both exhausted, frustrated, and smelly. As evening approached, and the plumbing situation remained unresolved, Beatrice's patience finally snapped. This is hopeless, she cried, her voice filled with despair. We're going to have to close the inn. We're going to lose everything. Marco, seeing her distress, put his arms around her, trying to comfort her. No, Beatrice, he said, his voice gentle. We will not lose everything. We will fix it. Together. Beatrice, leaning against him, felt her anger dissipating. She was tired of fighting, tired of arguing. She just wanted a hot shower and a clean bathroom. I'm sorry, Marco, she said, her voice muffled against his chest. I overreacted. He stroked her hair, his touch soothing and reassuring. It's okay, Beatrice, he said. You're stressed. And I am not a very good plumber. They stood there, in the midst of the plumbing chaos, holding each other, finding comfort in their shared misery. The plumbing problems, while frustrating, had ultimately brought them closer. They had faced another challenge, another obstacle, and they had survived. Later that evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, exhausted and dejected, a miracle occurred. The water pressure suddenly returned, the gurgling sound ceased, and the toilets flushed. What happened? Beatrice asked, her eyes wide with surprise. Marco shrugged, a sheepish grin on his face. I don't know, he said. Maybe it fixed itself? Beatrice, while skeptical, didn't question their good fortune. She was just grateful to have running water again. As they celebrated their unexpected plumbing victory with a bottle of wine, Beatrice realized that their relationship, like the plumbing at the Potter di Sole, was temperamental. It had its ups and downs, its leaks and blockages. But it was also resilient. It could withstand pressure. And it always, eventually, seemed to fix itself. The pouty faces, the frustrated sighs, the moments of despair, they were all part of the process. They were a reminder that even the most loving relationships required work, patience, and a sense of humor. And, perhaps, a good plumber. Or, at least, a willingness to admit when you're out of your depth. Chapter 18. The Return of the Ex. Just when Beatrice and Marco thought they had finally navigated the treacherous waters of plumbing problems and past lovers, another storm cloud appeared on the horizon. This time, it wasn't a glamorous ex-girlfriend, but a familiar figure from Beatrice's past, Richard. Richard, having apparently tired of his yoga instructor and the spiritual enlightenment he'd sought, decided to revisit his options. He'd heard through the grapevine and, Beatrice suspected, through some strategic online stalking, that Beatrice was running in Tuscany. He decided, in his infinite wisdom, that he wanted her back. He arrived unannounced, of course, driving a rented sports car that was as ostentatious and out of place as he was. He emerged from the car, dressed in a designer suit that looked like it had been vacuum-sealed to his body. He looked, Beatrice thought, like a parody of his former self. "Beatrice," he said, his voice oozing with insincere charm. "You look rustic." Beatrice, who had been pruning roses in the garden, stared at him, her pruning shears clutched in her hand like a weapon. "Richard," she said, her voice flat. "What are you doing here?" Richard smiled, a practiced, calculated smile that Beatrice remembered all too well. "I came to see you, darling," he said. "To apologize. To reconcile." Beatrice, feeling a surge of disgust, took a step back. "Reconcile?" she repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. "After everything you did? After you left me for a woman half my age?" Richard waved his hand dismissively. "That was a mistake, Beatrice," he said. "A lapse in judgment. I realize now that you were the one I belong with." Beatrice, who had spent months mourning the loss of her marriage, felt a surge of anger. He was reducing their years together, their shared life, to a mistake? A lapse in judgment? "You're unbelievable, Richard," she said, her voice shaking with rage. Marco, who had been inside the inn, emerged, sensing the tension. He saw Beatrice, her face pale, her eyes flashing with anger. He saw Richard, his posture arrogant, his demeanor smug. He felt a surge of protective fury. "Who is this?" Marco asked, his voice dangerously low. Beatrice introduced them, her voice strained. "Marco, this is Richard. My ex-husband. Richard, this is Marco. My partner." Richard, assessing Marco with a condescending glance, extended his hand. "Partner?" he repeated, his tone implying that Marco was a temporary amusement. Marco ignored Richard's outstretched hand. He stepped in front of Beatrice, shielding her from Richard's presence. "You should leave," he said, his voice firm. Richard, taken aback by Marco's bluntness, raised an eyebrow. "I beg your pardon?" he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. "You are not welcome here," Marco said, his eyes fixed on Richard's. "Beatrice does not want to see you. She is with me now." Richard scoffed. "With you?" he repeated, his tone dismissive. "She's a New York woman, not a Tuscan peasant." Marco's fists clenched. He was about to respond physically when Beatrice placed a hand on his arm, restraining him. "Richard," Beatrice said, her voice calm but firm. "Marco is right. You need to leave. I have nothing to say to you." Richard, realizing that he wasn't going to win her back with his charm, changed his tactics. He tried to appeal to her sense of reason. He told her that he'd made a mistake, that he missed her, that he loved her. Beatrice, however, was unmoved. She'd heard it all before. She knew his manipulations, his lies. She was no longer the naive, trusting woman he'd married. "Goodbye, Richard," she said, her voice final. Richard, finally accepting defeat, turned and walked back to his car. He drove away, the sound of his engine fading into the distance. Beatrice, feeling a sense of relief, leaned against Marco, her body trembling slightly. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. Marco wrapped his arms around her, holding her close.
"He is gone now, Beatrice," he said. "He will not bother you again."
The return of the ex, while unpleasant, had ultimately strengthened Beatrice and Marco's bond. It had reminded them of the past they had both overcome, of the love they had found, of the future they were building together. Richard, with his arrogance and his insincerity, had only served to highlight the contrast between him and Marco. He had reminded Beatrice why she had left him and why she had chosen Marco, and, in doing so, unintentionally solidified their relationship more than ever. Chapter 19. Family, Food, and Forgiveness. Marco's family, a large, boisterous, and fiercely loving clan, descended upon the Potere di Sole for a Sunday lunch. Beatrice, having met a few of Marco's relatives individually, was both excited and apprehensive about meeting the entire extended family at once. "Don't worry, Beatrice," Marco reassured her, sensing her nervousness. "They will love you. They are good people." Beatrice, however, had her doubts. She was, after all, an outsider, a foreigner, a city woman. She was different from them, and she worried that they wouldn't accept her. The family arrived in a flurry of activity, bringing with them a cacophony of voices, laughter, and the aroma of home-cooked food. There were aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, and even a few children, all eager to meet the woman who had captured Marco's heart. Beatrice was immediately overwhelmed. She was introduced to so many people, so quickly, that she couldn't possibly remember all their names. She was bombarded with questions, comments, and advice, all delivered in rapid-fire Italian that she struggled to understand. Marco, sensing her discomfort, stayed by her side, translating, guiding, and protecting her from the onslaught of his overenthusiastic family. The lunch, a multi-course feast of traditional Tuscan dishes, was overwhelming. There was pasta, risotto, roasted meats, grilled vegetables, salads, cheeses, breads, and desserts, all served in enormous portions. Beatrice, accustomed to smaller, more refined meals, felt like she was drowning in food. "Eat, Beatrice, eat." Marco's nonna urged her, piling more food onto her plate. "You are too skinny." Beatrice, trying to be polite, forced herself to eat, even though she was already full. She didn't want to offend Marco's family, especially his nonna. As the lunch progressed, Beatrice began to relax. She realized that Marco's family, despite their boisterousness, were genuinely kind and welcoming. They were curious about her, yes, but they were also accepting of her. They asked her about her life in New York, about her work, about her plans for the inn. They shared stories about Marco, about his childhood, about his art. They teased him, they praised him, they loved him. Beatrice, listening to them, felt a warmth spread through her. She was starting to understand Marco better, to see him through the eyes of his family. She was starting to feel like she was part of something bigger, something special. The forgiveness came, unexpectedly, from Marco's aunt, Sophia's sister. Beatrice had been worried about meeting her, fearing that she would resent her for taking Sophia's place in Marco's life. But Sophia's sister, a kind, gentle woman with sad eyes, surprised her. She took Beatrice's hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Marco is happy," she said, her voice soft. "That is all that matters." Sophia would have wanted him to be happy. Beatrice, her eyes filling with tears, felt the wave of relief. She had been carrying a burden of guilt, a fear that she was somehow dishonoring Sophia's memory. But Sophia's sister's words had lifted that burden. She had given her permission to love Marco, to be happy with him. The family lunch, while initially overwhelming, had ultimately been a healing experience. It had brought Beatrice closer to Marco, to his family, to his culture. It had shown her that she was accepted, that she was loved, that she was part of the family. As the family departed, leaving behind a mess of empty plates, wine bottles, and lingering laughter, Beatrice felt a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced in a long time. She was no longer an outsider, a foreigner, a city woman. She was Beatrice, Marco's partner, a member of his family, a part of the Patera di Soul. The food, the family, and the forgiveness had woven a tapestry of connection, a sense of home. And Beatrice knew, with absolute certainty, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. Chapter 20. Market Day Mayhem. The weekly market in the nearby village was a vibrant, bustling affair, a kaleidoscope of colors, sounds, and smells. It was a place where locals gathered to buy fresh produce, local crafts, and gossip. Beatrice, initially overwhelmed by the chaos, had come to appreciate the market's unique charm. It was a place where she could connect with the community, practice her Italian, and find inspiration for the inn's menu. One particular market day, however, turned into mayhem. Beatrice and Marco had a long list of items to buy, and the market was unusually crowded. They were navigating the throngs of people, their arms laden with shopping bags, when they encountered Isabella. Isabella, dressed in a brightly colored dress that accentuated her curves, was holding court at a stall selling handmade jewelry. She was surrounded by a group of admiring men, her laughter echoing through the market.
Marco, caro,
she exclaimed, spotting him. You're here. And with Beatrice. Her tone implied that Beatrice was an unfortunate appendage. Beatrice, feeling a familiar surge of irritation, managed a polite smile. Isabella, she said, her voice neutral. Isabella, ignoring Beatrice, focused her attention on Marco. I have something to show you, Marco, she said, her voice seductive. She held up a necklace, a delicate silver chain with a turquoise pendant. It reminded me of you, of your eyes. Marco, clearly uncomfortable, shifted his weight. It's nice, Isabella, he said, his voice noncommittal. Isabella, undeterred, continued her flirtation. She asked Marco about his art, about his plans for the inn, about his life. She was deliberately excluding Beatrice, making her feel like an invisible bystander. Beatrice, feeling her patience wearing thin, decided to intervene. Marco, she said, her voice firm, we need to go. We have a lot of shopping to do.
Marco, Rilith, Nadith.
Yes, Beatrice, he said. We should go. Isabella, however, wasn't ready to relinquish her hold on Marco. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch lingering. Don't be a stranger, Marco, she said, her voice soft. We should get together soon. Marco, gently removing her hand, said, Goodbye, Isabella. As they walked away, Beatrice couldn't resist a sarcastic comment. She's very persistent, isn't she? She said, her voice laced with irritation.
Marco Said.
She is just being Isabella, he said. Beatrice, however, wasn't convinced. She'd seen the way Isabella had looked at Marco, the way she'd touched him. It was more than just friendliness. It was a challenge. The market day mayhem continued when they encountered Bella, the goat. Bella, having apparently escaped from Isabella's care again, was wreaking havoc at a stall selling fresh produce. She was happily munching on a pile of artichokes, her owner nowhere in sight. Oh, no, Marco groaned. Not again. Beatrice, despite her annoyance, couldn't help but laugh. The goat, it seemed, was a constant source of chaos and comedy. They spent the next hour chasing Bella through the market, apologizing to vendors, and trying to prevent her from eating everything in sight. They finally managed to corral her, with the help of a kindly farmer and a bucket of apples. Exhausted, frustrated, and covered in goat hair, they returned to the inn, their shopping bags forgotten. The market day mayhem, while stressful, had also been strangely bonding. They had faced another challenge together, another absurdity, and they had survived. As they sat on the terrace, sharing a bottle of wine and laughing about their chaotic day, Beatrice realized that the market, like their relationship, was unpredictable. It was filled with surprises, challenges, and moments of unexpected joy. It was a microcosm of their life together, a reflection of their love. The mayhem, she decided, was part of the charm. It was what made their life interesting, what made their relationship strong, what made their love story unique. And, despite the occasional goat-induced chaos, she wouldn't have it any other way. Chapter 21. 2 left feet, 1 big heart. Marco, a natural dancer, loved to move to the rhythm of the music. Beatrice, on the other hand, had 2 left feet and a distinct lack of coordination. She'd always avoided dancing, fearing embarrassment and public humiliation. One evening, however, Marco decided to change that. He'd found an old record player in the attic, along with a collection of vintage vinyl records. He set up the record player on the terrace, put on a romantic Italian song, and extended his hand to Beatrice. "Dance with me, Beatrice," he said, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Beatrice hesitated. She'd managed to avoid dancing with Marco for months, using various excuses and diversionary tactics. But tonight, she couldn't resist his invitation. "I can't dance, Marco," she said, her voice filled with apprehension. Marco smiled, a reassuring smile that made her heart melt. "I will teach you," he said. "It's easy. Just follow my lead." He took her hand, pulled her close, and began to sway to the music. Beatrice, stiff and awkward, tried to follow his lead, but she stumbled, stepped on his toes, and nearly fell.
"Sorry." She apologized for the 10th time.
Marco just laughed, his eyes filled with amusement. "No worries, Beatrice," he said. "You're learning." He continued to guide her, patiently showing her the steps, whispering encouragement in her ear, his breath warm against her skin. He didn't judge her, he didn't criticize her, he just loved her. And, slowly, miraculously, Beatrice began to relax. She began to feel the music, to move with the rhythm, to trust Marco's lead. She was still clumsy, still awkward, but she was dancing. As they danced, under the Tuscan stars, the night air filled with the romantic melody, Beatrice felt a sense of freedom she'd never experienced before. She was shedding her inhibitions, her fears, her self-consciousness. She was simply enjoying the moment, enjoying the closeness of Marco, enjoying the magic of the dance. Marco, sensing her transformation, spun her around, his eyes locked on hers. Beatrice, laughing, felt a surge of joy. She was no longer the uptight, corporate lawyer who was afraid to dance. She was Beatrice, the woman who loved Marco, the woman who was willing to try anything, even if it meant making a fool of herself. As the song ended, they stood there, breathless, their bodies close, their hearts beating in unison. Marco, looking at Beatrice, his eyes filled with love, leaned in and kissed her. It was a kiss that was different from their previous kisses. It was deeper, more passionate, more uninhibited. It was a kiss that celebrated their connection, their growth, their love. "You are a natural, Beatrice," Marco said, his voice husky with emotion. Beatrice, smiling, shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm just in love." The 2 left feet, she realized, were no longer an obstacle. They were a reminder of her journey, of her transformation, of her willingness to embrace the unexpected. They were a symbol of her love for Marco, a love that had taught her to dance, to laugh, to live. And, as they continued to dance the night away, under the Tuscan stars, Beatrice knew that she would follow Marco's lead, wherever it might take her, even if it meant stepping on his toes a few more times. The big heart, she knew, was what truly mattered. And hers, filled with love for Marco, was bigger than ever. Chapter 22. The smell of rain and regret. A sudden summer storm rolled in, transforming the Tuscan landscape into a dramatic spectacle of wind, rain, and thunder. Beatrice and Marco, caught in the downpour while returning from a trip to a nearby town, found themselves soaked to the bone. The storm, however, was more than just a weather event. It was a catalyst, stirring up emotions and unearthing buried regrets. As they huddled together in the inn, listening to the rain lashing against the windows, Beatrice felt a wave of melancholy. The smell of rain, usually a comforting scent, brought back memories of her past, of her failed marriage, of her lost dreams. "I used to love storms," she said, her voice soft, her gaze fixed on the rain-streaked window. "Richard and we would sit by the fire, drink wine, and listen to the thunder." Marco, sensing her sadness, placed a comforting arm around her waist.
"And now?"
he asked, his voice gentle. Beatrice sighed. "Now they just make me feel sad," she said. "They remind me of what I've lost." Marco, understanding her pain, held her closer. He knew that the past, even when buried, could still haunt. He had his own ghosts, his own regrets. "We all have losses, Beatrice," he said, his voice soft. "But we also have gains. We have new beginnings." Beatrice, leaning against him, felt a flicker of hope. He was right. She had lost a lot, but she had also gained so much. She had found love, happiness, and a new life in Tuscany. The storm, however, continued to rage, both outside and within. As the thunder crashed and the lightning illuminated the room, Beatrice's regrets resurfaced, stronger and more vivid. "I wasted so much time, Marco," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Years trying to be someone I wasn't. Trying to please Richard. Trying to fit in." Marco stroked her hair, his touch soothing and reassuring. "You were searching, Beatrice," he said. "You were finding your way. But what if I made the wrong choices?" she asked, her voice filled with doubt. "What if I ruined my life?" Marco turned her to face him, his eyes searching hers. "You did not ruin your life, Beatrice," he said, his voice firm. "You created a new one. A better one." He kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that eased her anxiety. He held her close, his warmth chasing away the chill of the storm. As the storm gradually subsided and the rain softened to a gentle drizzle, Beatrice's regrets began to fade. She realized that the past, while painful, was also part of her story. It had shaped her, molded her, led her to this moment, to this place, to Marco. The smell of rain, no longer a scent of sadness, became a scent of renewal. It was a reminder that even after the darkest storms, the sun would eventually shine again. As they sat together, watching the last of the rain fall, Beatrice felt a sense of peace. She had faced her regrets, her fears, her doubts, and she had emerged stronger, more resilient, more in love with Marco than ever before. The smell of rain, she knew, would always evoke memories. But now, those memories would be tinged with hope, with gratitude, with love. The regret, while still present, was no longer overwhelming. It was a part of her past, but it did not define her future. And, with Marco by her side, she knew that future was bright. Chapter 23. Letters from New York. A letter arrived from New York, not from Richard this time, but from Beatrice's former law firm. It was an offer, a tempting offer, to return to her old job, to resume her career as a high-powered corporate lawyer. Beatrice, reading the letter, felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of her, the ambitious, driven part, was intrigued. It was a validation of her skills, her talent, her worth. It was a chance to reclaim her former life, to prove that she was still capable. But another part of her, the part that had fallen in love with Tuscany, with Marco, with her new life, was hesitant. She had built something special here, something meaningful. She had found happiness, contentment, and a sense of purpose that she'd never known in New York. She showed the letter to Marco, her hands trembling slightly. "They want me to come back," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Marco, reading the letter, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in his chest. He didn't want to lose Beatrice. He couldn't imagine his life without her. "What will you do?" he asked, his voice strained. Beatrice, torn between two worlds, two lives, two futures, didn't know. She was at a crossroads, a turning point. She had to make a decision that would affect not only her own life, but also Marco's. She spent the day wandering through the inn, through the garden, through the olive groves, seeking clarity, seeking guidance. She thought about her past, her present, her future. She weighed her options, her desires, her fears. She thought about her life in New York, the fast-paced, high-pressure world of corporate law. The long hours, the demanding clients, the constant stress, the loneliness, the emptiness, the lack of fulfillment. She thought about her life in Tuscany, the slow-paced, simple, yet chaotic existence of running a dilapidated inn. The early mornings, the hard work, the endless challenges, the laughter, the love, the sense of belonging. She thought about Richard, his ambition, his materialism, his lack of empathy. She thought about Marco, his kindness, his passion, his unconditional love. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the Tuscan hills, Beatrice finally made her decision. She knew what she wanted. She knew what she needed. She found Marco in his art studio, working on a new painting. He looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I've decided," Beatrice said, her voice firm. Marco, bracing himself for disappointment, waited. Beatrice smiled, a radiant smile that lit up her face. "I'm staying," she said. "I'm staying here. With you." Marco, relief washing over him, let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He rushed to her, wrapping his arms around her, holding her tight. "Thank you, Beatrice," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Thank you." He kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their commitment, their love, their future together. The letters from New York, while tempting, had ultimately reaffirmed Beatrice's choice. They had reminded her of what she had left behind, and what she had found. They had shown her that her true home, her true happiness, was here, in Tuscany, with Marco. As they stood together, watching the sunset, Beatrice knew that she had made the right decision. She was no longer torn between two worlds. She had chosen her world, and it was perfect. The letters, she decided, would be filed away, a reminder of her past, but not a temptation for her future. Her future was here, with Marco, under the Tuscan sun. Chapter 24. A recipe for disaster and romance. Beatrice, inspired by the abundance of fresh, local ingredients, decided to create a signature dish for the Potere di Sole. She envisioned a dish that would showcase the flavors of Tuscany, a dish that would be both delicious and memorable. She spent hours researching recipes, experimenting with different combinations of herbs, spices, and vegetables. She wanted to create something unique, something that would reflect her own culinary style, a blend of her New York sophistication and her newfound Tuscan simplicity. Marco, while supportive of her culinary ambitions, was also skeptical. He believed that traditional Tuscan cuisine was perfect as it was, and that there was no need to reinvent the wheel. "Beatrice," he said, watching her chop vegetables with a ferocity he'd never seen before, "you are making it too complicated. Just keep it simple. Like Nana's pasta." Beatrice, however, was determined to prove him wrong. She wanted to create a dish that would impress him, that would surprise him, that would wow him. She decided to make a roasted vegetable tart with a homemade crust, a creamy cheese filling, and a topping of fresh herbs and edible flowers. It was an ambitious dish, a complex dish, a dish that required precision and skill. The preparation process, predictably, was chaotic. Beatrice, following her meticulously crafted recipe, measured, weighed, and timed everything with scientific accuracy. Marco, meanwhile, hovered around the kitchen, offering unsolicited advice and criticism. "Too much salt," he exclaimed, tasting the filling. "Not enough basil," he declared, sniffing the herbs. "The crust is too thick," he pronounced, poking the dough. Beatrice, feeling her patience wearing thin, tried to ignore him. She was determined to follow her recipe, to trust her instincts, to create her masterpiece. The disaster struck when she was blind baking the crust. She'd forgotten to prick the bottom of the crust with a fork, and it puffed up like a balloon, cracking and collapsing in the oven. "Oh no!" Beatrice cried, staring at the ruined crust. "It's destroyed." Marco, seeing her distress, tried to comfort her. "It's okay, Beatrice," he said. "We can start again." Beatrice, however, was despondent. She'd spent hours preparing the dish, and now it was ruined. She felt like a failure. "I can't do it, Marco," she said, her voice filled with despair. "I'm not a chef. I'm just a lawyer." Marco, taking her hands in his, looked at her, his eyes filled with love. "You are more than a lawyer, Beatrice," he said. "You are creative. You are passionate. You are amazing." He kissed her, a gentle, tender kiss that eased her anxiety. "We will make it together," he said. "We will create a new dish, a simpler dish, a better dish." They decided to abandon the tart and make pasta instead. Marco, taking the lead, showed Beatrice how to make fresh pasta from scratch, using just flour, eggs, and water. Beatrice, following his instructions, found herself enjoying the process. It was therapeutic, calming, and surprisingly satisfying. She was no longer focused on perfection, on following a recipe, on impressing anyone. She was simply enjoying the moment, enjoying the company of Marco, enjoying the simplicity of the task. The pasta, when it was finished, was perfect. It was light, delicate, and delicious. They served it with a simple sauce of fresh tomatoes, basil, and garlic, a sauce that Marco had taught her to make. As they sat down to eat, under the Tuscan stars, Beatrice realized that the recipe for disaster had, unexpectedly, turned into a recipe for romance. The failed tart, the chaotic kitchen, the shared frustration, they had all brought them closer. They had learned to work together, to support each other, to find joy in the simplicity of cooking and eating together. Chapter 25. The Art of Letting Go. Beatrice received a package from New York. It was from a gallery owner, a friend of a friend, who had seen photos of Marco's art online thanks to Beatrice's efforts to promote the inn and Marco's work. The gallery owner was impressed by Marco's talent and was offering him a solo exhibition. It was a dream come true for Marco, a chance to showcase his art to a wider audience, a chance to gain recognition, a chance to achieve his lifelong ambition. Beatrice, thrilled for Marco, encouraged him to accept the offer. She knew how much this meant to him, how hard he'd worked, how much he deserved this opportunity. Marco, however, was hesitant. He was worried about leaving the inn, about leaving Beatrice. He was afraid that the exhibition would change things, that it would take him away from her. "I don't want to go, Beatrice," he said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "I don't want to leave you." Beatrice, touched by his devotion, reassured him. "It's just for a few weeks, Marco," she said. "I can manage the inn. And I'll come to New York for the opening. We'll be together." Marco, still unsure, argued that the exhibition was too much, too soon. He was comfortable with his life in Tuscany, with his art, with Beatrice. He didn't need fame or fortune. Beatrice, however, knew that he was selling himself short. He had a gift, a talent that deserved to be shared with the world. She wouldn't let him hide his light under a bushel. Or, in this case, under a Tuscan olive tree. "Marco," she said, her voice firm, "you have to do this. You have to let go of your fears. You have to embrace this opportunity." She told him that she believed in him, that she was proud of him, that she would support him every step of the way. She reminded him of his dreams, of his passion, of his art. Marco, listening to her, felt his resolve strengthen. He knew she was right. He couldn't let fear hold him back. He had to take a leap of faith. He had to trust in his talent, in his art, in Beatrice. He agreed to the exhibition, and the preparations began. Beatrice helped him choose the paintings, arrange the shipping, and plan the trip to New York. She was his manager, his muse, his rock. The art of letting go, Beatrice realized, was not just about releasing the past, it was also about embracing the future. It was about trusting in the unknown, about taking risks, about supporting the dreams of the person you love. As Marco prepared to leave for New York, Beatrice felt a pang of sadness. She would miss him terribly, but she also felt a surge of pride. She was happy for him, excited for him, and confident that he would succeed. The art of letting go, she knew, was a bittersweet process. It involved sacrifice, separation, and a degree of uncertainty. But it also involved growth, opportunity, and the potential for even greater love. And as she watched Marco board the plane, a mix of sadness and excitement in her heart, she knew that their love was strong enough to withstand distance, time, and any challenges that might come their way. The letting go, she realized, was not an ending, but a new beginning. A chance for Marco to shine, and a chance for their love to grow even stronger. Chapter 26.
Sunrise, sunset, seconde chance.
Beatrice flew to New York for the opening of Marco's exhibition. She hadn't been back to the city since she'd left, and the familiar sights, sounds, and smells evoked a mix of nostalgia and relief. She was glad to be back, but she was also glad to know that she no longer belonged there. The exhibition was a triumph. Marco's paintings, vibrant and evocative, captured the beauty of the Tuscan landscape, the warmth of the Italian sun, and the passion of his soul. The gallery was filled with art critics, collectors, and admirers, all eager to praise Marco's talent. Beatrice, watching Marco from across the room, felt a surge of pride. He was in his element, surrounded by people who appreciated his art, who recognized his genius. He was shining, radiating a confidence and a charisma that she'd always known he possessed. During the evening, Beatrice encountered several people from her former life. Her old colleagues, her former boss, even Richard. They were all surprised to see her, surprised by her transformation. They had expected her to be miserable, defeated, perhaps even regretful. But Beatrice was none of those things. She was happy, radiant, and filled with a quiet confidence that they couldn't quite understand. She had found something in Tuscany, something that they had never found in their fast-paced, high-pressure world. Peace. Richard, predictably, tried to rekindle their relationship. He told her that he'd made a mistake, that he missed her, that he regretted letting her go. Beatrice, however, was unmoved. She saw him now for what he was, a shallow, self-absorbed man who was incapable of true love. "I'm happy, Richard," she said, her voice firm. "I've found someone who loves me for who I am, not for what I can do for him." Richard, realizing that he'd lost her forever, walked away, defeated. As the evening drew to a close, Beatrice and Marco found themselves alone on the gallery's rooftop terrace, overlooking the city skyline. The sunrise and sunset, symbolic of their respective journeys, were mirrored in the city lights. "It's beautiful," Beatrice said, gazing at the view. Marco nodded, his arm around her waist. "But not as beautiful as Tuscany," he said. He turned to face her, his eyes filled with love. "Thank you, Beatrice," he said, his voice soft. "For believing in me.
For supporting me. For loving me."
Beatrice smiled, her heart overflowing with happiness. "Thank you, Marco," she said, "for showing me the way, for giving me a second chance, for making me believe in love again." They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their bond, their commitment, their love. It was a kiss that celebrated their journey, their triumph, their future together. The sunrise, representing Beatrice's new beginning in Tuscany, and the sunset, representing Marco's past life fading away, had converged. They had both been given a second chance, a chance to rewrite their stories, a chance to find true happiness. And as they stood there under the New York sky, they knew that their second chances had led them to each other. And that was all that mattered. The city, with all its glitter and glamour, couldn't compare to the simple beauty of their life in Tuscany, the unconditional love they shared, and the endless possibilities that lay ahead. Chapter 27. The Truth About Tomatoes. Back in Tuscany, Beatrice and Marco returned to their chaotic, beautiful life at the Pottera di Sole. The success of Marco's exhibition had brought a new wave of interest in the inn, and they were busier than ever. One morning, as they were working in the garden, Beatrice noticed that Marco was avoiding the tomato patch. He'd been reluctant to plant tomatoes in the first place, claiming that they were messy and attracted bugs. But Beatrice had insisted, and he'd eventually acquiesced. "What's wrong, Marco?" Beatrice asked, noticing his unease. "You don't like tomatoes?" Marco hesitated, his face flushing slightly. "It's not that I don't like them," he said, his voice evasive. "It's just I'm allergic." Beatrice stared at him, her mouth agape. "Allergic?" she repeated, her voice filled with disbelief. "You're allergic to tomatoes? But you're Italian." Marco shrugged, a sheepish grin on his face. "It's rare," he admitted. "But it happens." Beatrice, trying to process this revelation, felt a mix of amusement and frustration. He'd let her plant an entire patch of tomatoes, knowing that he couldn't eat them. He'd let her argue with him about it, knowing that he was allergic. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice laced with exasperation. Marco avoided her gaze. "I didn't want to disappoint you," he said. "You were so excited about the tomatoes. And I didn't want you to think I was weak." Beatrice, shaking her head, couldn't help but laugh. He was ridiculous, adorable, and completely infuriating. "Marco," she said, her voice softening. "You could never disappoint me. And allergies don't make you weak. They just make you human." She took his hand, her touch gentle and reassuring.
"It's okay, Marco," she said.
"I understand." The truth about tomatoes, while unexpected, revealed a deeper truth about Marco. It showed his vulnerability, his desire to please her, his fear of disappointing her. It showed his love. Beatrice, realizing the depth of his feelings, felt her heart swell with affection. She loved him, even more, for his quirks, his flaws, his allergies. As they stood there in the garden, surrounded by the forbidden fruit, Beatrice had an idea. "We'll make pesto," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Lots and lots of pesto, with basil and pine nuts and Parmesan cheese. And no tomatoes." Marco smiled, a relieved and grateful smile.
"Pesto is good," he said.
"Very good." The truth about tomatoes, while seemingly trivial, had become a symbol of their relationship. It was a reminder of their differences, their compromises, and their unconditional love. It was a reminder that even the most unexpected allergies couldn't come between them. And as they harvested the basil, their hands brushing against each other, their laughter echoing through the garden, Beatrice knew that their love story, like a good pesto, was perfectly imperfect. It was a blend of different ingredients, a mix of sweet and savory, a recipe for happiness. The tomatoes, while off limits for Marco, would still be enjoyed by Beatrice. And that, she decided, was perfectly fine. The truth, she realized, was always better than a lie, even when it came to tomatoes. Chapter 28. A wedding invitation, not theirs. An invitation arrived, thick, creamy paper embossed with elegant script. It wasn't for Beatrice and Marco, but for Isabella. She was getting married to a wealthy businessman from Milan. Beatrice, reading the invitation, felt a mix of relief and surprise. She'd always suspected that Isabella's interest in Marco was fleeting, a game she played to boost her ego. The invitation confirmed her suspicions. Marco, however, seemed unfazed by the news. He'd known all along that Isabella wasn't serious about him. He'd never had any romantic feelings for her, and he was happy for her. "She deserves to be happy," he said, his voice sincere. Beatrice, impressed by his maturity and his lack of jealousy, felt a surge of respect for him. He was truly a good man, a man who wished happiness for everyone, even for those who had caused him annoyance. They decided to attend the wedding as a gesture of goodwill and community spirit. It was, after all, a village event, and they were part of the village. The wedding was a lavish affair, held at a grand villa overlooking the Tuscan countryside. There were hundreds of guests, elaborate decorations, and a seemingly endless supply of food and wine. Beatrice, dressed in a simple but elegant dress, felt out of place amongst the glamorous guests. She was no longer accustomed to such opulence, and she found it somewhat overwhelming. Marco, however, seemed to take it all in stride. He mingled with the guests, chatted with the locals, and even danced with a few of the older women. He was charming, gracious, and completely unfazed by the extravagance. Isabella, radiant in a designer wedding gown, greeted them with a smug smile. "Marco, caro," she said, ere kissing him on both cheeks. "I'm so glad you could come." And Beatrice,
"How nice to see you."
Her tone implied that Beatrice's presence was barely tolerable. Beatrice, ignoring Isabella's condescension, congratulated her. "You look beautiful, Isabella," she said, her voice sincere. "I wish you all the happiness in the world." Isabella, taken aback by Beatrice's genuine kindness, seemed momentarily speechless. She'd expected resentment, jealousy, perhaps even a snide remark. But Beatrice had disarmed her with her grace and generosity. As the evening progressed, Beatrice found herself enjoying the wedding. She danced with Marco, laughed with his family, and even shared a few friendly words with some of the villagers. She was relaxed, comfortable, and happy. The wedding invitation, while not theirs, had served as a reminder of how far they'd come. It had shown them that they were strong, secure, and completely committed to each other. It had also shown them that they were accepted by the community, that they were part of something bigger than themselves. As they drove back to the Potere di Sole, under the Tuscan moon, Beatrice felt a sense of contentment. She was grateful for her life, for her love, for her home. The wedding, while not their own, had been a celebration of love, and that, she realized, was something worth celebrating. The invitation, she decided, would be kept as a souvenir, a reminder of their journey, their growth, and their unwavering love. It was a symbol of closure, of moving on, and of embracing the future. And, as she looked at Marco, his eyes filled with love, she knew that their future was bright. Chapter 29. Building bridges, breaking walls. The Potere di Sole, while charming, was still in need of significant repairs. Beatrice and Marco, having tackled the most urgent issues, the roof, the plumbing, the goat incursions, decided to focus on renovating the main building. They wanted to create a space that was both functional and beautiful, a space that reflected their shared vision for the inn. They wanted to preserve the building's history, while also modernizing it to meet the needs of contemporary guests. Their different approaches, however, led to new challenges. Beatrice, with her practical mindset, focused on efficiency and cost-effectiveness. Marco, with his artistic eye, focused on aesthetics and authenticity. "We need to replace these windows," Beatrice said, pointing to the old, drafty windows in the living room. "They're energy inefficient. We'll save money on heating costs in the long run." Marco, however, argued that the old windows were part of the building's character. He wanted to restore them, not replace them. "They have history, Beatrice," he said. "They have soul." Beatrice, while appreciating his sentimentality, argued that practicality should trump aesthetics. "We can't run an inn with drafty windows, Marco," she said. "Guests will complain. They'll be cold." Their disagreement escalated into a full-blown argument, their voices echoing through the empty rooms. Beatrice accused Marco of being impractical, unrealistic, and stubborn. Marco accused Beatrice of being cold, calculating, and insensitive to beauty. The building project, meant to be a shared endeavor, became a source of tension, a battleground for their conflicting visions. They were building bridges, yes, but they were also breaking walls both literally and figuratively. The breakthrough came, unexpectedly, during a trip to a local salvage yard. Beatrice, searching for affordable building materials, stumbled upon a collection of old, reclaimed windows. They were beautiful, unique, and perfectly suited to the inn's character. She showed them to Marco, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Look, Marco," she said. "We can have both. We can have history and efficiency." Marco, examining the windows, felt a surge of admiration for Beatrice. She had found a solution that satisfied both their needs, a compromise that honored both their visions. "You are amazing, Beatrice," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. They bought the windows, and the renovation project resumed, with a renewed sense of collaboration and mutual respect. They were building bridges, not just between the old and the new, but also between themselves. As they worked together, installing the windows, painting the walls, and furnishing the rooms, they realized that their differences, while often challenging, were also their strength. They complemented each other, balanced each other, and made each other better. The building project, while difficult, had ultimately strengthened their bond. It had taught them to compromise, to communicate, and to appreciate each other's perspectives. It had shown them that they could build something beautiful together, not just a building but also a life. The walls they had broken, both literally and figuratively, had made way for new connections, new understandings, and a newfound appreciation for their shared journey. And as they stood back, admiring their handiwork, they knew that the Potere di Sole, like their love, was built to last. Chapter 30. Under the Tuscan moon. The renovations were complete. The Potere di Sole, once a dilapidated ruin, was now a charming, welcoming inn, a testament to Beatrice and Marco's love, labor, and unwavering commitment. They decided to celebrate with a small, intimate gathering, inviting their closest friends and family. It wasn't a grand reopening, but a quiet acknowledgement of their achievement, a celebration of their journey. As the guests arrived, Mingling on the terrace, enjoying the warm Tuscan evening, Beatrice felt a surge of happiness. She had everything she'd ever wanted: a loving partner, a beautiful home, a fulfilling life. Marco, standing beside her, his arm around her waist, felt the same contentment. He had found his muse, his soulmate, his home in Beatrice. He had rediscovered his passion for art, for life, for love. As the moon rose over the Tuscan hills, casting a silvery glow over the scene, Marco took Beatrice's hand.
"Come with me," he said, his voice soft.
He led her to a secluded spot in the garden, a place where they had shared many special moments. He had prepared a surprise for her. He'd set up his easel, a blank canvas illuminated by the moonlight. He placed 2 chairs in front of the canvas, and a bottle of wine, and 2 glasses on a small table. "What's this?" Beatrice asked, her eyes filled with curiosity. Marco smiled, a mischievous smile that made her heart flutter.
"I want to paint you," he said.
Under the Tuscan moon. Beatrice, touched by his gesture, agreed. She sat on one of the chairs, facing the canvas, the moon casting a soft glow on her face. Marco, his eyes filled with love, began to paint. He didn't use brushes or colors, but his fingers, dipped in the wine. He painted with swift, sure strokes, capturing her essence, her beauty, her spirit on the blank canvas.
As he painted, he talked.
He told her how much he loved her, how much she meant to him, how she had changed his life. He told her that she was his muse, his inspiration, his everything. Beatrice, listening to him, felt her heart overflow with love. She had never felt so cherished, so appreciated, so seen. As the painting neared completion, Marco stepped back, admiring his work. It wasn't a traditional portrait, but an abstract representation of Beatrice, a reflection of her inner beauty, her strength, her love. "It's us," Beatrice said, her voice filled with emotion. "It's our love story." Marco nodded, his eyes meeting hers.
"Yes," he said. "It is."
He leaned in and kissed her, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their love, their commitment, their future together. It was a kiss that transcended words, a kiss that spoke volumes. Under the Tuscan moon, surrounded by the beauty of the night, the fragrance of the garden, and the presence of their loved ones, Beatrice and Marco had found their happily ever after. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but a real, authentic, and perfectly imperfect love story. It was a story of second chances, of unexpected journeys, of finding love in the most unlikely of places. It was a story of building bridges, breaking walls, and creating a home together under the Tuscan sun, and now under the Tuscan moon. Their love, like the inn, had been renovated, restored, and reborn. And it was, they both knew, a love that would last a lifetime. Epilogue. Years passed. The Pottera di Sole flourished, becoming a beloved destination for travelers from all over the world. Beatrice and Marco, their love deepening with each passing year, continued to welcome guests, share stories, and live their dream. They had their ups and downs, their challenges and triumphs. They faced storms, both literal and figurative. But their love, like the sturdy walls of the inn, remained strong and unwavering. They never did have a formal wedding. They didn't need rings or vows to prove their commitment. Their love was evident in every glance, every touch, every shared moment. One evening, as they were sitting on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in vibrant hues of orange and purple, Marco turned to Beatrice. "You know," he said, his voice soft, "we never did officially get engaged." Beatrice smiled, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "Are you proposing, Marco?" she asked.
"Marco Cekel."
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, velvet box. Inside, nestled on a bed of satin, was a ring. It wasn't a diamond, but a simple silver band, adorned with a single turquoise stone, the color of the Tuscan sky. "Will you marry me, Beatrice?" he asked, his voice filled with love. Beatrice, tears welling up in her eyes, nodded. "Yes, Marco," she said. "Yes, I will." They kissed, a long, passionate kiss that sealed their promise, their future, their forever. The Tuscan moon, a silent witness to their love story, shone brightly above them, casting its magical glow on their happily ever after. The ring, a symbol of their belated engagement, was a perfect addition to their imperfect love story. It was a reminder that it's never too late to say yes to love, to happiness, to forever.